Self-Help, with illustrations of conduct and perseverance by Samuel Smiles. Chapter 10, Money, Its Use and Abuse, Part 2. The late Sir Charles Napier, in taking leave of his command in India, did a bold and honest thing in publishing his strong protest, embodied in his last general order to the officers of the Indian Army, against the fast life led by so many young officers in that service, involving them in ignominious obligations. Sir Charles strongly urged in that famous document what had almost been lost sight of, that, quote, honesty is inseparable from the character of a thoroughbred gentleman, and that to drink unpaid for champagne and unpaid for beer, to ride unpaid for horses, is to be a cheat and not a gentleman, end quote. Men who lived beyond their means, and were summoned, often by their own servants, before courts of requests for debts contracted in extravagant living, might be officers by virtue of their commissions, but they were not gentlemen. The habit of being constantly in debt, the commander-in-chief held, made men grow callous to the proper feelings of a gentleman. It was not enough that an officer should be able to fight. That any bulldog could do. But did he hold his word inviolate? Did he pay his debts? These were among the points of honor which, he insisted, illuminated the true gentleman's and soldier's career. As Bayard was of old, so would Sir Charles Napier have all British officers be. He knew them to be without fear, but he would also have them without reproach. There are, however, many gallant young fellows, both in India and at home, capable of mounting a breach on an emergency amidst belching fires, and of performing the most desperate deeds of valor, who, nevertheless, cannot or will not exercise the moral courage necessary to enable them to resist a petty temptation presented to their senses. They cannot utter their valiant "no," or "I can't afford it," to the invitations of pleasure and self-enjoyment. They are found ready to brave death rather than the ridicule of their companions. The young man, as he passes through life, advances through a long line of tempters ranged on either side of him, and the inevitable effect of yielding is degradation in a greater or a less degree. Contact with them tends insensibly to draw away from him some portion of the divine electric element with which his nature is charged, and his only mode of resisting them is to utter and to act out his "no" manfully and resolutely. He must decide at once, not waiting to deliberate and balance reasons, for the youth, like the woman who deliberates, is lost. Many deliberate without deciding, but not to resolve is to resolve. A perfect knowledge of man is in the prayer, "Lead us not into temptation." But temptation will come to try the young man's strength, and once yielded to, the power to resist grows weaker and weaker. Yield once, and a portion of virtue has gone. Resist manfully, and the first decision will give strength for life. Repeated, it will become a habit. It is in the outworks of the habits formed in early life that the real strength of the defense must lie, for it has been wisely ordained that the machinery of moral existence should be carried on principally through the medium of the habits, so as to save the wear and tear of the great principles within. It is good habits which insinuate themselves into the thousand inconsiderable acts of life that really constitute by far the greater parts of man's moral conduct. Hugh Miller has told how, by an act of youthful decision, he saved himself from one of the strong temptations so peculiar to a life of toil. When employed as a mason, it was usual for his fellow workmen to have an occasional treat of drink, and one day 2 glasses of whiskey fell to his share, which he swallowed. When he reached home, he found, on opening his favorite book, Bacon's Essays, that the letters danced before his eyes, and that he could no longer master the sense. "The condition," he says, "to which I had brought myself was, I felt, one of degradation. I had sunk by my own act, for the time, to a lower level of intelligence than that on which it was my privilege to be placed. And though the state could have been no very favorable one for forming a resolution, I, in that hour, determined that I should never again sacrifice my capacity of intellectual enjoyment to a drinking usage, and with God's help I was enabled to hold by that determination." It is such decisions as this that often form the turning points of a man's life and furnish the foundations of his future character. And this rock on which Hugh Miller might have been wrecked, if he had not at the right moment put forth his moral strength to strike away from it, is one that youth and manhood alike need to be constantly on their guard against. It is about one of the worst and most deadly, as well as extravagant, temptations which lie in the way of youth. Sir Walter Scott used to say that, "of all vices, drinking is the most incompatible with greatness." Not only so, but it is incompatible with economy, decency, health, and honest living. When a youth cannot restrain, he must abstain. Dr. Johnson's case is the case of many. He said, referring to his own habits, "Sir, I can abstain, but I can't be moderate." But to wrestle vigorously and successfully with any vicious habit, we must not merely be satisfied with contending on the low ground of worldly prudence, though that is of use, but take stand upon a higher moral elevation. Mechanical aid such as pledges may be of service to some, but the great thing is to set up a high standard of thinking and acting, and endeavor to strengthen and purify the principles as well as to reform the habits. For this purpose a youth must study himself, watch his steps, and compare his thoughts and acts with his rule. The more knowledge of himself he gains, the more humble will he be, and perhaps the less confident in his own strength. But the discipline will always be found most valuable which is acquired by resisting small present gratifications to secure a perspective greater and higher one. It is the noblest work in self-education, for, "real glory springs from the silent conquest of ourselves, and without that the conqueror is naught but the first slave." Many popular books have been written for the purpose of communicating to the public the grand secret of making money. But there is no secret whatever about it, as the proverbs of every nation abundantly testify. Take care of the pennies, and the pounds will take care of themselves. Diligence is the mother of good luck. No pains, no gains. No sweat, no sweet. Work, and thou shalt have. The world is his who has patience and industry. Better to go to bed supperless than rise in debt. Such are specimens of the proverbial philosophy embodying the hoarded experience of many generations as to the best means of thriving in the world. They were current in people's mouths long before books were invented, and like other popular proverbs, they were the first codes of popular morals. Moreover, they have stood the test of time, and the experience of every day still bears witness to their accuracy, force, and soundness. The Proverbs of Solomon are full of wisdom as to the force of industry and the use and abuse of money. He that is slothful in work is brother to him that is a great waster. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways, and be wise. Poverty, says the preacher, shall come upon the idler, as one that travelleth, and want as an armed man. But of the industrious and upright, the hand of the diligent maketh rich. The drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty and drowsiness, shall clothe a man with rags. Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. But above all, it is better to get wisdom than gold, for wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things that may be desired are not to be compared to it. Simple industry and thrift will go far towards making any person of ordinary working faculty comparatively independent in his means. Even a working man may be so, provided he will carefully husband his resources and watch the little outlets of useless expenditure. A penny is a very small matter, yet the comfort of thousands of families depends upon their proper spending and saving of pennies. If a man allows the little pennies, the result of his hard work, to slip out of his fingers, some to the beer shop, some this way and some that, he will find that his life is little raised above one of mere animal drudgery. On the other hand, if he take care of the pennies, putting some weekly into a benefit society or an insurance fund, others into a savings bank, and confiding the rest to his wife to be carefully laid out with a view to the comfortable maintenance and education of his family, he will soon find that this attention to small matters will abundantly repay him in increasing means, growing comfort at home, and a mind comparatively free from fears as to the future. And if a working man have high ambition and possess richness in spirit, a kind of wealth which far transcends all mere worldly possessions, he may not only help himself, but be a profitable helper to others in his path through life. That this is no impossible thing even for a common laborer in a workshop may be illustrated by the remarkable career of Thomas Wright of Manchester, who not only attempted but succeeded in the reclamation of many criminals while working for weekly wages in a foundry. Accident first directed Thomas Wright's attention to the difficulty encountered by liberated convicts in returning to habits of honest industry. His mind was shortly possessed by the subject, and to remedy the evil became the purpose of his life. Though he worked from 6 in the morning till 6 at night, still there were leisure minutes that he could call his own, more especially on his Sundays, and these he employed in the service of convicted criminals, a class then far more neglected than they are now. But a few minutes a day, well employed, can effect a great deal, and it will scarcely be credited that in 10 years this working man, by steadfastly holding to his purpose, succeeded in rescuing not fewer than 300 felons from continuance in a life of villainy. He came to be regarded as the moral physician of the Manchester Old Bailey, and where the chaplain and all others had failed, Thomas Wright often succeeded. Children he thus restored, reformed to their parents. Sons and daughters otherwise lost, to their homes. And many a returned convict did he contrive to settle down to honest and industrious pursuits. The task was by no means easy. It required money, time, energy, prudence, and above all, character, and the confidence which character invariably inspires. The most remarkable circumstance was that Wright relieved many of these poor outcasts out of the comparatively small wages earned by him at foundry work. And he did all this on an income which did not average, during his working career, £100 per annum. And yet, while he was able to bestow substantial aid on criminals to whom he owed no more than the service of kindness which every human being owes to another, he also maintained his family in comfort, and was, by frugality and carefulness, enabled to lay by a store of savings against his approaching old age. Every week he apportioned his income with deliberate care, so much for the indispensable necessities of food and clothing, so much for the landlord, so much for the schoolmaster, so much for the poor and needy, and the lines of distribution were resolutely observed. By such means did this humble workman pursue his great work, with the results we have so briefly described. Indeed, his career affords one of the most remarkable and striking illustrations of the force of purpose in a man, of the might of small means carefully and sedulously applied, and above all, of the power which an energetic and upright character invariably exercises upon the lives and conduct of others. There is no discredit, but honor, in every right walk of industry, whether it be tilling the ground, making tools, weaving fabrics, or selling the products behind a counter. A youth may handle a yardstick, or measure a piece of ribbon, and there will be no discredit in doing so, unless he allows his mind to have no higher range than the stick and the ribbon, to be as short as the one and as narrow as the other. "Let not those blush who have," said Fuller, "but those who have not a lawful calling." And Bishop Hall said, "Sweet is the destiny of all trades, whether of the brow or of the mind." Men who have raised themselves from a humble calling need not be ashamed, or rather ought to be proud of the difficulties they have surmounted. An American president, when asked what was his coat of arms, remembering that he had been a hewer of wood in his youth, replied, "A pair of shirt sleeves." A French doctor once taunted Fléchier, Bishop of Nîmes, who had been a tallow chandler in his youth, with the meanness of his origin, to which Fléchier replied, "If you had been born in the same condition that I was, you would still have been but a maker of candles." Nothing is more common than energy in money making, quite independent of any higher object than its accumulation. A man who devotes himself to this pursuit, body and soul, can scarcely fail to become rich. Very little brains will do. Spend less than you earn, add guinea to guinea, scrape and save, and the pile of gold will gradually rise. Osterwald, the Parisian banker, began life a poor man. He was accustomed every evening to drink a pint of beer for supper at a tavern which he visited, during which he collected and pocketed all the corks that he could lay his hands on. In 8 years he had collected as many corks as sold for 8 louis d'ors. With that sum he laid the foundations of his fortune, gained mostly by stock jobbing, leaving at his death some 3,000,000 francs. John Foster has cited a striking illustration of what this kind of determination will do in money making. A young man who ran through his patrimony, spending it in profligacy, was at length reduced to utter want and despair. He rushed out of his house intending to put an end to his life, and stopped on arriving at an eminence overlooking what was once his estates. He sat down, ruminated for a time, and rose with the determination that he would recover them. He returned to the streets, saw a load of coals which had been shot out of a cart under the pavement before a house, offered to carry them in, and was employed. He thus earned a few pence, requested some meat and drink as a gratuity, which was given him, and the pennies were laid by. Pursuing this menial labor, he earned and saved more pennies, accumulated sufficient to enable him to purchase some cattle, the value of which he understood, and these he sold to advantage. He proceeded by degrees to undertake larger transactions, until at length he became rich. The result was that he more than recovered his possessions, and died an inveterate miser. When he was buried, mere earth went to earth. With a nobler spirit, the same determination might have enabled such a man to be a benefactor to others as well as to himself, but the life and its end in this case were alike sordid. To provide for others and for our own comfort and independence in old age is honorable and greatly to be commended, but to hoard for mere wealth's sake is a characteristic of the narrow-souled and the miserly. It is against the growth of this habit of inordinate saving that the wise man needs most carefully to guard himself, else what in youth was simple economy may in old age grow into avarice, and what was a duty in one case may become a vice in the other. It is the love of money, not money itself, which is the root of evil. A love which narrows and contracts the soul and closes it against generous life and action. Since Sir Walter Scott makes one of his characters declare that The penny siller slew more souls than the naked sword slew bodies. It is one of the defects of business too exclusively followed that it insensibly tends to a mechanism of character. The businessman gets into a rut, and often does not look beyond it. If he lives for himself only, he becomes apt to regard other human beings only insofar as they minister to his ends. Take a leaf from such men's ledgers, and you have their life. Worldly success, measured by the accumulation of money, is no doubt a very dazzling thing, and all men are naturally more or less the admirers of worldly success. But though men of persevering, sharp, dexterous, and unscrupulous habits, ever on the watch to push opportunities, may and do get on in the world, yet it is quite possible that they may not possess the slightest elevation of character nor a particle of real goodness. He who recognizes no higher logic than that of the shilling may become a very rich man, and yet remain all the while an exceedingly poor creature. For riches are no proof whatever of moral worth. Their glitter often serves only to draw attention to the worthlessness of their possessor, as the light of the glowworm reveals the grub. The manner in which many allow themselves to be sacrificed to their love of wealth reminds one of the cupidity of the monkey, that caricature of our species. In Algiers, the Kabyle peasant attaches a gourd, well fixed, to a tree, and places within it some rice. The gourd has an opening merely sufficient to admit the monkey's paw. The creature comes to the tree by night, inserts his paw, and grasps his booty. He tries to draw it back, but it is clenched, and he has not the wisdom to unclench it. So there he stands until morning, when he is caught, looking as foolish as may be, though with the prize in his grasp. The moral of this story is capable of a very extensive application in life. The power of money is on the whole overestimated. The greatest things which have been done for the world have not been accomplished by rich men, nor by subscription lists, but by men generally of small pecuniary means. Christianity was propagated over half the world by men of the poorest class, and the greatest thinkers, discoverers, inventors, and artists have been men of moderate wealth, many of them little raised above the condition of manual laborers in point of worldly circumstances, and it will always be so. Riches are oftener an impediment than a stimulus to action, and in many cases they are quite as much a misfortune as a blessing. The youth who inherits wealth is apt to have a life made too easy for him, and he soon grows sated with it, because he has nothing left to desire. Having no special object to struggle for, he finds time to hang heavy on his hands. He remains morally and spiritually asleep, and his position in society is often no higher than that of a polypus over which the tide floats. His only labor is to kill the time, and labor dire it is, and weary woe. Yet the rich man, inspired by a right spirit, will spurn idleness as unmanly, and if he bethink himself of the responsibilities which attach to the possession of wealth and property, he will feel even a higher call to work than men of humbler lot. This, however, must be admitted to be by no means the practice of life. The golden mean of Agar's perfect prayer is, perhaps, the best lot of all, did we but know it. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me. The late Joseph Brotherton, M.P., left a fine motto to be recorded upon his monument in the Peel Park at Manchester, the declaration in his case being strictly true. My richness consisted not in the greatness of my possessions, but in the smallness of my wants. He rose from the humblest station, that of a factory boy, to an eminent position of usefulness by the simple exercise of homely honesty, industry, punctuality, and self-denial. Down to the close of his life, when not attending Parliament, he did duty as minister in a small chapel in Manchester to which he was attached, and in all things he made it appear to those who knew him in private life that the glory he sought was not to be seen of men, or to excite their praise, but to earn the consciousness of discharging the everyday duties of life, down to the smallest and humblest of them, in an honest, upright, truthful, and loving spirit. Respectability, in its best sense, is good. The respectable man is one worthy of regard, literally worth turning to look at. But the respectability that consists in merely keeping up appearances is not worth looking at in any sense. Far better and more respectable is the good poor man than the bad rich one. Better the humble silent man than the agreeable well-appointed rogue who keeps his gig. A well-balanced and well-stored mind, a life full of useful purpose, whatever the position occupied in it may be, is of far greater importance than average worldly respectability. The highest object of life we take to be to form a manly character, and to work out the best development possible of body and spirit, of mind, conscience, heart, and soul. This is the end. All else ought to be regarded but as the means. Accordingly, that is not the most successful life in which a man gets the most pleasure, the most money, the most power or place, honor or fame, but that in which a man gets the most manhood, and performs the greatest amount of useful work and of human duty. Money is power after its sort, it is true, but intelligence, public spirit, and moral virtue are powers too, and far nobler ones. "Let others plead for pensions," wrote Lord Collingworth to a friend. "I can be rich without money, by endeavoring to be superior to everything poor. I would have my services to my country unstained by any interested motive, and old Scott and I can go on in our cabbage garden without much greater expense than formerly." On another occasion he said, "I have motives for my conduct which I would not give in exchange for 100 pensions." The making of a fortune may no doubt enable some people to enter society, as it is called, but to be esteemed there they must possess qualities of mind, manners, or heart, else they are merely rich people, nothing more. There are men in society now as rich as Croesus, who have no consideration extended towards them and elicit no respect. For why? They are but as money bags. Their only power is in their till. The men of mark in society, the guides and rulers of opinion, the really successful and useful men, are not necessarily rich men, but men of sterling character, of disciplined experience, and of moral excellence. Even the poor man, like Thomas Wright, though he possesses but little of this world's goods, may, in the enjoyment of a cultivated nature, of opportunities used and not abused, of a life spent to the best of his means and ability, look down, without the slightest feeling of envy, upon the persons of mere worldly success, the man of money bags and acres. End of section 27.
Self-Help, with Illustrations of Conduct and Perseverance, by Samuel Smiles. Section 28, Chapter 11, Self-Culture, Facilities and Difficulties, Part 1. Chapter 11, Self-Culture, Facilities and Difficulties. Every person has two educations, one which he receives from others, and one, more important, which he gives to himself. Gibbon. Is there one whom difficulties dishearten, who bends to the storm? He will do little. Is there one who will conquer? That kind of man never fails. John Hunter. The wise and active conquer difficulties by daring to attempt them. Sloth and folly shiver and shrink at sight of toil and danger, and make the impossibility they fear. Rowe. The best part of every man's education, said Sir Walter Scott, is that which he gives to himself. The late Sir Benjamin Brodie delighted to remember this saying, and he used to congratulate himself on the fact that professionally he was self-taught. But this is necessarily the case with all men who have acquired distinction in letters, science, or art. The education received at school or college is but a beginning, and is valuable mainly inasmuch as it trains the mind and habituates it to continuous application and study. That which is put into us by others is always far less ours than that which we acquire by our own diligent and persevering effort. Knowledge conquered by labor becomes a possession, a property entirely our own. A greater vividness and permanency of impression is secured, and facts thus acquired become registered in the mind in a way that mere imparted information can never effect. This kind of self-culture also calls forth power and cultivates strength. The solution of one problem helps the mastery of another, and thus knowledge is carried into faculty. Our own active effort is the essential thing, and no facilities, no books, no teachers, no amount of lessons learned by rote will enable us to dispense with it. The best teachers have been the readiest to recognize the importance of self-culture and of stimulating the student to acquire knowledge by the active exercise of his own faculties. They have relied more upon training than upon telling, and sought to make their pupils themselves active parties to the work in which they were engaged, thus making teaching something far higher than the mere passive reception of the scraps and details of knowledge. This was the spirit in which the great Dr. Arnold worked. He strove to teach his pupils to rely upon themselves and develop their powers by their own active efforts, himself merely guiding, directing, stimulating, and encouraging them. "I would far rather," he said, "send a boy to Van Diemen's Land, where he must work for his bread, than send him to Oxford to live in luxury, without any desire in his mind to avail himself of his advantages." "If there be one thing on earth," he observed on another occasion, "which is truly admirable, it is to see God's wisdom blessing an inferiority of natural powers when they have been honestly, truly, and zealously cultivated." Speaking of a pupil of this character, he said, "I would stand to that man hat in hand." Once at Laleham, when teaching a rather dull boy, Arnold spoke somewhat sharply to him, on which the pupil looked up in his face and said, "Why do you speak angrily, sir? Indeed, I am doing the best I can." Years afterwards, Arnold used to tell the story to his children, and added, "I never felt so much in my life. That look and that speech I have never forgotten." From the numerous instances already cited of men of humble station who have risen to distinction in science and literature, it will be obvious that labor is by no means incompatible with the highest intellectual culture. Work in moderation is healthy, as well as agreeable to the human constitution. Work educates the body, as study educates the mind, and that is the best state of society, in which there is some work for every man's leisure, and some leisure for every man's work. Even the leisure classes are in a measure compelled to work, sometimes as a relief from ennui, but in most cases to gratify an instinct which they cannot resist. Some go fox hunting in the English counties, others grouse shooting in the Scotch hills, while many wander away every summer to climb mountains in Switzerland. Hence the boating, running, cricketing, and athletic sports of the public schools, in which our young men at the same time so healthfully cultivate their strength both of mind and body. It is said that the Duke of Wellington, when once looking on at the boys engaged in their sports in the playground at Eton, where he had spent many of his own younger days, made the remark, "It was there that the Battle of Waterloo was won." Daniel Malthus urged his son when at college to be most diligent in the cultivation of knowledge, but he also enjoined him to pursue manly sports as the best means of keeping up the full working power of his mind, as well as of enjoying the pleasures of intellect. "Every kind of knowledge," said he, "every acquaintance with nature and art will amuse and strengthen your mind, and I am perfectly pleased that cricket should do the same by your arms and legs. I love to see you excel in the exercises of the body, and I think myself that the better half, and much the most agreeable part, of the pleasures of the mind is best enjoyed while one is upon one's legs." But a still more important use of active employment is that referred to by the great divine Jeremy Taylor. "Avoid idleness," he says, "and fill up all the spaces of thy time with severe and useful employment, for lust easily creeps in at those emptinesses where the soul is unemployed and the body is at ease, for no easy, healthful, idle person was ever chaste if he could be tempted. But of all employments, bodily labor is the most useful, and of the greatest benefit for driving away the devil. Practical success in life depends more upon physical health than is generally imagined. Hodson, of Hodson's Horse, writing home to a friend in England, said, "I believe, if I get on well in India, it will be owing, physically speaking, to a sound digestion." The capacity for continuous working in any calling must necessarily depend in a great measure upon this, and hence the necessity for attending to health, even as a means of intellectual labor. It is perhaps to the neglect of physical exercise that we find amongst students so frequent a tendency towards discontent, unhappiness, inaction, and reverie, displaying itself in contempt for real life and disgust at the beaten tracks of men, a tendency which in England has been called Byronism, and in Germany, Wertherism. Dr. Channing noted the same growth in America, which led him to make the remark that too many of our young men grow up in a school of despair. The only remedy for this green sickness in youth is physical exercise, action, work, and bodily occupation. The use of early labor in self-imposed mechanical employments may be illustrated by the boyhood of Sir Isaac Newton. Though a comparatively dull scholar, he was very assiduous in the use of his saw, hammer, and hatchet, knocking and hammering in his lodging-room, making models of windmills, carriages, and machines of all sorts, and as he grew older, he took delight in making little tables and cupboards for his friends. Smeaton, Watt, and Stevenson were equally handy with tools when mere boys, and but for such kind of self-culture in their youth, it is doubtful whether they would have accomplished so much in their manhood. Such was also the early training of the great inventors and mechanics described in the preceding pages, whose contrivance and intelligence were practically trained by the constant use of their hands in early life. Even where men belonging to the manual labor class have risen above it and become more purely intellectual laborers, they have found the advantages of their early training in their later pursuits. Elihu Burritt says he found hard labor necessary to enable him to study with effect, and more than once he gave up school teaching and study, and, taking to his leather apron again, went back to his blacksmith's forge and anvil for his health of body and mind's sake. The training of young men in the use of tools would, at the same time that it educated them in common things, teach them the use of their hands and arms, familiarize them with healthy work, exercise their faculties upon things tangible and actual, give them some practical acquaintance with mechanics, impart to them the ability of being useful, and implant in them the habit of persevering physical effort. This is an advantage which the working classes, strictly so called, certainly possess over the leisure classes, that they are in early life under the necessity of applying themselves laboriously to some mechanical pursuit or other, thus acquiring manual dexterity in the use of their physical powers. The chief disadvantage attached to the calling of the laborious classes is not that they are employed in physical work, but that they are too exclusively so employed, often to the neglect of their moral and intellectual faculties. While the youths of the leisure classes, having been taught to associate labor with servility, have shunned it, and been allowed to grow up practically ignorant, the poorer classes, confining themselves within the circle of their laborious callings, have been allowed to grow up in a large proportion of cases absolutely illiterate. It seems possible, however, to avoid both these evils by combining physical training or physical work with intellectual culture, and there are various signs abroad which seem to mark the gradual adoption of this healthier system of education. The success of even professional men depends in no slight degree on their physical health, and a public writer has gone so far as to say that the greatness of our great men is quite as much a bodily affair as a mental one. A healthy breathing apparatus is as indispensable to the successful lawyer or politician as a well-cultured intellect. The thorough aeration of the blood by free exposure to a large breathing surface in the lungs is necessary to maintain that full vital power on which the vigorous working of the brain in so large a measure depends. The lawyer has to climb the heights of his profession through close and heated courts, and the political leader has to bear the fatigue and excitement of long and anxious debates in a crowded house. Hence the lawyer in full practice and the parliamentary leader in full work are called upon to display powers of physical endurance and activity even more extraordinary than those of the intellect. Such powers as have been exhibited in so remarkable a degree by Brougham, Lyndhurst, and Campbell, by Peel, Graham, and Palmerston, all full-chested men. Though Sir Walter Scott, when at Edinburgh College, went by the name of the Greek blockhead, he was, notwithstanding his lameness, a remarkably healthy youth. He could spear a salmon with the best fisher on the Tweed, and ride a wild horse with any hunter in Yarrow. When devoting himself in after life to literary pursuits, Sir Walter never lost his taste for field sports, but while riding Waverley in the morning, he would in the afternoon course hares. Professor Wilson was a very athlete, as great at throwing the hammer as in his flights of eloquence and poetry. And Burns, when a youth, was remarkable chiefly for his leaping, putting, and wrestling. Some of our greatest divines were distinguished in their youth for their physical energies. Isaac Barrow, when at the Charterhouse School, was notorious for his pugilistic encounters, in which he got many a bloody nose. Andrew Fuller, when working as a farmer's lad at Soham, was chiefly famous for his skill in boxing, and Adam Clark, when a boy, was only remarkable for the strength displayed by him in rolling large stones about. The secret, possibly, of some of the power which he subsequently displayed in rolling forth large thoughts in his manhood. While it is necessary, then, in the first place, to secure this solid foundation of physical health, it must also be observed that the cultivation of the habit of mental application is quite indispensable for the education of the student. The maxim that labor conquers all things holds especially true in the case of the conquest of knowledge. The road into learning is alike free to all who will give the labor and the study requisite to gather it. Nor are there any difficulties so great that the student of resolute purpose may not surmount and overcome them. It was one of the characteristic expressions of Chatterton that God had sent his creatures into the world with arms long enough to reach anything if they chose to be at the trouble. In study, as in business, energy is the great thing. There must be the fervid opus. We must not only strike the iron while it is hot, but strike it till it is made hot. It is astonishing how much may be accomplished in self-culture by the energetic and the persevering, who are careful to avail themselves of opportunities and use up the fragments of spare time which the idle permit to run to waste. Thus Ferguson learned astronomy from the heavens, while wrapped in a sheepskin on the Highland hills. Thus Stone learnt mathematics while working as a journeyman gardener. Thus Drew studied the highest philosophy in the intervals of cobbling shoes. And thus Miller taught himself geology while working as a day laborer in a quarry. Sir Joshua Reynolds, as we have already observed, was so earnest a believer in the force of industry that he held that all men might achieve excellence if they would but exercise the power of assiduous and patient working. He held that drudgery lay on the road to genius, and that there was no limit to the proficiency of an artist except the limit of his own painstaking. He would not believe in what is called inspiration, but only in study and labor. Excellence, he said, is never granted to man but as the reward of labor. If you have great talents, industry will improve them. If you have but moderate abilities, industry will supply their deficiency. Nothing is denied to well-directed labor. Nothing is to be obtained without it. Sir Fowell Buxton was an equal believer in the power of study, and he entertained the modest idea that he could do as well as other men if he devoted to the pursuit double the time and labor that they did. He placed his great confidence in ordinary means and extraordinary application. I have known several men in my life, says Dr. Ross, who may be recognized in days to come as men of genius, and they were all plodders, hard-working, intent men. Genius is known by its works. Genius without works is a blind faith, a dumb oracle. But meritorious works are the result of time and labor, and cannot be accomplished by intention or by a wish. Every great work is the result of vast preparatory training. Facility comes by labor. Nothing seems easy, not even walking, that was not difficult at first. The orator whose eye flashes instantaneous fire and whose lips pour out a flood of noble thoughts, startling by their unexpectedness and elevating by their wisdom and truth, has learned his secret by patient repetition and after many bitter disappointments. Thoroughness and accuracy are two principal points to be aimed at in study. Francis Horner, in laying down rules for the cultivation of his mind, placed great stress upon the habit of continuous application to one subject for the sake of mastering it thoroughly. He confined himself with this object to only a few books, and resisted with the greatest firmness every approach to a habit of desultory reading. The value of knowledge to any man consists not in its quantity, but mainly in the good uses to which he can apply it. Hence a little knowledge, of an exact and perfect character, is always found more valuable for practical purposes than any extent of superficial learning. One of Ignatius Loyola's maxims was, "He who does well one work at a time does more than all." By spreading our efforts over too large a surface, we inevitably weaken our force, hinder our progress, and acquire a habit of fitfulness and ineffective working. Lord St. Leonards once communicated to Sir Fowell Buxton the mode in which he had conducted his studies, and thus explained the secret of his success. "I resolved," said he, "when beginning to read law, to make everything I acquired perfectly my own, and never to go to a second thing till I had entirely accomplished the first. Many of my competitors read as much in a day as I read in a week, but at the end of 12 months my knowledge was as fresh as the day it was acquired, or theirs had glided away from recollection." It is not the quantity of study that one gets through, or the amount of reading, that makes a wise man, but the appositeness of the study to the purpose for which it is pursued, the concentration of the mind for the time being on the subject under consideration, and the habitual discipline by which the whole system of mental application is regulated. Abernethy was even of opinion that there was a point of saturation in his own mind, and that if he took into it something more than it could hold, it only had the effect of pushing something else out. Speaking of the study of medicine, he said, "If a man has a clear idea of what he desires to do, he will seldom fail in selecting the proper means of accomplishing it." The most profitable study is that which is conducted with a definite aim and object. By thoroughly mastering any given branch of knowledge, we render it more available for use at any moment. Hence it is not enough merely to have books, or to know where to read for information as we want it. Practical wisdom, for the purposes of life, must be carried about with us, and be ready for use at call. It is not sufficient that we have a fund laid up at home, but not a farthing in the pocket. We must carry about with us a store of the current coin of knowledge ready for exchange on all occasions, else we are comparatively helpless when the opportunity for using it occurs. Decision and promptitude are as requisite in self-culture as in business. The growth of these qualities may be encouraged by accustoming young people to rely upon their own resources, leaving them to enjoy as much freedom of action in early life as is practicable. Too much guidance and restraint hinder the formation of habits of self-help. They are like bladders tied under the arms of one who has not taught himself to swim. Want of confidence is perhaps a greater obstacle to improvement than is generally imagined. It has been said that half the failures in life arise from pulling in one's horse while he is leaping. Dr. Johnson was accustomed to attribute his success to confidence in his own powers. True modesty is quite compatible with a due estimate of one's own merits, and does not demand the abnegation of all merit. Though there are those who deceive themselves by putting a false figure before their ciphers, the want of confidence, the want of faith in one's self, and consequently the want of promptitude in action, is a defect of character which is found to stand very much in the way of individual progress, and the reason why so little is done is generally because so little is attempted. There is usually no want of desire on the part of most persons to arrive at the results of self-culture, but there is a great aversion to pay the inevitable price for it, of hard work. Dr. Johnson held that impatience of study was the mental disease of the present generation, and the remark is still applicable. We may not believe that there is a royal road to learning, but we seem to believe very firmly in a popular one. In education, we invent labor-saving processes, seek shortcuts to science, learn French and Latin in 12 lessons, or without a master. We resemble the lady of fashion, who engaged a master to teach her on condition that he did not plague her with verbs and participles. We get our smattering of science in the same way. We learn chemistry by listening to a short course of lectures enlivened by experiments. And when we have inhaled laughing gas, seen green water turn to red, and phosphorus burnt in oxygen, we have got our smattering, of which the most that can be said is that, though it may be better than nothing, it is yet good for nothing. Thus we often imagine we are being educated while we are only being amused. The facility with which young people are thus induced to acquire knowledge without study and labor is not education. It occupies, but does not enrich the mind. It imparts a stimulus for the time, and produces a sort of intellectual keenness and cleverness, but without an implanted purpose and a higher object than mere pleasure, it will bring with it no solid advantage. In such cases, knowledge produces but a passing impression, a sensation, but no more. It is, in fact, the merest epicurism of intelligence, sensuous, but certainly not intellectual. Thus the best qualities of many minds, those which are evoked by vigorous effort and independent action, sleep a deep sleep, and are often never called to life, except by the rough awakening of sudden calamity or suffering, which, in such cases, comes as a blessing, if it serves to rouse up a courageous spirit that, for it, would have slept on. Accustomed to acquire information under the guise of amusement, young people will soon reject that which is presented to them under the aspect of study and labor. Learning their knowledge in science and sport, they will be too apt to make sport of both, while the habit of intellectual dissipation thus engendered cannot fail, in course of time, to produce a thoroughly emasculating effect both upon their mind and character. Multifarious reading, said Robertson of Brighton, weakens the mind like smoking, and is an excuse for its lying dormant. It is the idlest of all idlenesses, and leaves more of impotency than any other. The evil is a growing one, and operates in various ways. Its least mischief is shallowness, its greatest the aversion to steady labor which it induces, and the low and feeble tone of mind which it encourages. If we would be really wise, we must diligently apply ourselves, and confront the same continuous application which our forefathers did. For labor is still, and ever will be, the inevitable price set upon everything which is valuable. We must be satisfied to work with a purpose, and wait the results with patience. All progress of the best kind is slow. But to him who works faithfully and zealously, the reward will, doubtless, be vouchsafed in good time. The spirit of industry, embodied in a man's daily life, will gradually lead him to exercise his powers on objects outside himself, of greater dignity and more extended usefulness. And still we must labor on, for the work of self-culture is never finished. To be employed, said the poet Gray, is to be happy. It is better to wear out than rust out, said Bishop Cumberland. Have we not all eternity to rest in? Exclaimed Arnaud. Ripu ailleurs was the motto of Marnix de Saint-Aldegonde, the energetic and ever-working friend of William the Silent. End of section 28. Recording by Kat Din in Osaka, Japan. Self-Help, with Illustrations of Conduct and Perseverance, by Samuel Smiles. Section 29, Chapter 11, Self-Culture, Facilities and Difficulties, Part 2. It is the use we make of the powers entrusted to us which constitutes our only just claim to respect. He who employs his one talent aright is as much to be honored as he to whom 10 talents have been given. There is really no more personal merit attaching to the possession of superior intellectual powers than there is in the succession to a large estate. How are those powers used? How is that estate employed? The mind may accumulate large stores of knowledge without any useful purpose, but the knowledge must be allied to goodness and wisdom, and embodied in upright character, else it is not. Pestalozzi even held intellectual training by itself to be pernicious, insisting that the roots of all knowledge must strike and feed in the soil of the rightly governed will. The acquisition of knowledge may, it is true, protect a man against the meaner felonies of life, but not in any degree against its selfish vices, unless fortified by sound principles and habits. Hence do we find in daily life so many instances of men who are well informed in intellect, but utterly deformed in character, filled with the learning of the schools, yet possessing little practical wisdom, and offering examples for warning rather than imitation. An often quoted expression at this day is that knowledge is power, but so are fanaticism, despotism, and ambition. Knowledge of itself, unless wisely directed, might merely make bad men more dangerous, and the society in which it was regarded as the highest good little better than a pandemonium. It is possible that at this day we may even exaggerate the importance of literary culture. We are apt to imagine that because we possess many libraries, institutes, and museums, we are making great progress. But such facilities may as often be a hindrance as a help to individual self-culture of the highest kind. The possession of a library, or the free use of it, no more constitutes learning than the possession of wealth constitutes generosity. Though we undoubtedly possess great facilities, it is nevertheless true, as of old, that wisdom and understanding can only become the possession of individual men by traveling the old road of observation, attention, perseverance, and industry. The possession of the mere materials of knowledge is something very different from wisdom and understanding, which are reached through a higher kind of discipline than that of reading, which is often but a mere passive reception of other men's thoughts, there being little or no active effort of mind in the transaction. Then how much of our reading is but the indulgence of a sort of intellectual dram-drinking, imparting a grateful excitement for the moment, without the slightest effect in improving and enriching the mind, or building up the character? Thus, many indulge themselves in the conceit that they are cultivating their minds, when they are only employed in the humbler occupation of killing time, of which perhaps the best that can be said is that it keeps them from doing worse things. It is also to be borne in mind that the experience gathered from books, though often valuable, is but of the nature of learning, whereas the experience gained from actual life is of the nature of wisdom, and a small store of the latter is worth vastly more than any stock of the former. Lord Bolingbroke truly said that whatever study tends neither directly nor indirectly to make us better men and citizens is at best but a specious and ingenious sort of idleness, and the knowledge we acquire by it only a creditable kind of ignorance, nothing more. Useful and instructive though good reading may be, it is yet only one mode of cultivating the mind, and is much less influential than practical experience and good example in the formation of character. There were wise, valiant, and true-hearted men bred in England, long before the existence of a reading public. Magna Carta was secured by men who signed the deed with their marks. Though altogether unskilled in the art of deciphering the literary signs by which principles were denominated upon paper, they yet understood and appreciated, and boldly contended for, the things themselves. Thus, the foundations of English liberty were laid by men who, though illiterate, were nevertheless of the very highest stamp of character. And it must be admitted that the chief object of culture is, not merely to fill the mind with other men's thoughts, and to be the passive recipient of their impressions of things, but to enlarge our individual intelligence and render us more useful and efficient workers in the sphere of life to which we may be called. Many of our most energetic and useful workers have been but sparing readers. Brindley and Stevenson did not learn to read and write until they reached manhood, and yet they did great works and lived manly lives. John Hunter could barely read or write when he was 20 years old, though he could make tables and chairs with any carpenter in the trade. "I never read," said the great physiologist when lecturing before his class, "this," pointing to some part of the subject before him. "This is the work that you must study if you wish to become eminent in your profession." When told that one of his contemporaries had charged him with being ignorant of the dead languages, he said, "I would undertake to teach him that on the dead body which he never knew in any language, dead or living." It is not, then, how much a man may know that is of importance, but the end and purpose for which he knows it. The object of knowledge should be to mature wisdom and improve character, to render us better, happier, and more useful, more benevolent, more energetic, and more efficient in the pursuits of every high purpose in life. When people once fall into the habit of admiring and encouraging ability as such, without reference to moral character, and religious and political opinions are the concrete form of moral character, they are on the highway to all sorts of degradation. We must ourselves be and do, and not rest satisfied merely with reading and meditating over what other men have been and done. Our best light must be made life, and our best thought action. At least we ought to be able to say, as Richter did, "I have made as much out of myself as could be made of the stuff, and no man should require more. For it is every man's duty to discipline and guide himself, with God's help, according to his responsibilities and the faculties with which he has been endowed." Self-discipline and self-control are the beginnings of practical wisdom, and these must have their root in self-respect. Hope springs from it. Hope, which is the companion of power and the mother of success. For whoso hopes strongly has within him the gift of miracles. The humblest may say, to respect myself, to develop myself, this is my true duty in life. An integral and responsible part of the great system of society, I owe it to society and to its author not to degrade or destroy either my body, mind, or instincts. On the contrary, I am bound to the best of my power to give to those parts of my constitution the highest degree of perfection possible. I am not only to suppress the evil, but to evoke the good elements in my nature. And as I respect myself, so am I equally bound to respect others, as they on their part are bound to respect me. Hence, mutual respect, justice, and order, of which law becomes the written record and guarantee. Self-respect is the noblest garment with which a man may clothe himself, the most elevating feeling with which the mind can be inspired. One of Pythagoras' wisest maxims, in his golden verses, is that with which he enjoins the pupil to reverence himself. Borne up by this high idea, he will not defile his body by sensuality, nor his mind by servile thoughts. This sentiment, carried into daily life, will be found at the root of all the virtues: cleanliness, sobriety, chastity, morality, and religion. The pious and just honoring of ourselves, said Milton, may be thought the radical moisture and fountainhead from whence every laudable and worthy enterprise issues forth. To think meanly of oneself is to sink in one's own estimation as well as in the estimation of others. And as the thoughts are, so will the acts be. Man cannot aspire if he look down. If he will rise, he must look up. The very humblest may be sustained by the proper indulgence of this feeling. Poverty itself may be lifted and lighted up by self-respect. And it is truly a noble sight to see a poor man hold himself upright amidst his temptations, and refuse to demean himself by low actions. One way in which self-culture may be degraded is by regarding it too exclusively as a means of getting on. Viewed in this light, it is unquestionable that education is one of the best investments of time and labor. In any line of life, intelligence will enable a man to adapt himself more readily to circumstances, suggest improved methods of working, and render him more apt, skilled and effective in all respects. He who works with his head as well as his hands will come to look at his business with a clearer eye, and he will become conscious of increasing power, perhaps the most cheering consciousness the human mind can cherish. The power of self-help will gradually grow, and in proportion to a man's self-respect will he be armed against the temptation of low indulgences. Society and its action will be regarded with quite a new interest. His sympathies will widen and enlarge, and he will thus be attracted to work for others as well as for himself. Self-culture may not, however, end in eminence, as in the numerous instances above cited. The great majority of men, in all times, however enlightened, must necessarily be engaged in the ordinary avocations of industry, and no degree of culture which can be conferred upon the community at large will ever enable them, even were it desirable, which it is not, to get rid of the daily work of society which must be done. But this, we think, may also be accomplished. We can elevate the condition of labor by allying it to noble thoughts, which confer a grace upon the lowliest as well as the highest rank. For no matter how poor or humble a man may be, the great thinker of this and other days may come in and sit down with him, and be his companion for the time, though his dwelling be the meanest hut. It is thus that the habit of well-directed reading may become a source of the greatest pleasure and self-improvement, and exercise a gentle coercion, with the most beneficial results, over the whole tenor of man's character and conduct. And even though self-culture may not bring wealth, it will, at all events, give one the companionship of elevated thoughts. A nobleman once contemptuously asked of a sage, "What have you got by all your philosophy?" "At least I have got society and myself," was the wise man's reply. But many are apt to feel despondent and become discouraged in the work of self-culture, because they do not get on in the world so fast as they think they deserve to do. Having planted their acorn, they expect to see it grow into an oak at once. They have perhaps looked upon knowledge in the light of a marketable commodity, and are consequently mortified because it does not sell as they expected it would do. Mr. Tremenhere, in one of his education reports for 1840-41, states that a schoolmaster in Norfolk, finding his school rapidly falling off, made inquiry into the cause, and ascertained that the reason given by the majority of the parents for withdrawing their children was that they had expected education was to make them better off than they were before, but that having found it had done them no good, they had taken their children from school and would give themselves no further trouble about education. The same low idea of self-culture is but too prevalent in other classes, and is encouraged by the false views of life which are always more or less current in society. But to regard self-culture either as a means of getting past others in the world, or of intellectual dissipation and amusement, rather than as a power to elevate the character and expand the spiritual nature, is to place it on a very low level. To use the words of Bacon, knowledge is not a shop for profit or sale, but a rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. It is doubtless most honorable for a man to labor to elevate himself, and to better his condition in society, but this is not to be done at the sacrifice of himself. To make the mind the mere drudge of the body is putting it to a very servile use, and to go about whining and bemoaning our pitiful lot because we fail in achieving that success in life which, after all, depends rather upon habits of industry and attention to business details than upon knowledge, is the mark of a small and often of a sour mind. Such a temper cannot better be reproved than in the words of Robert Southey, who thus wrote to a friend who sought his counsel: "I would give you advice if it could be of use, but there is no curing those who choose to be diseased. A good man and a wise man may at times be angry with the world, at times grieved for it. But be sure no man was ever discontented with the world if he did his duty in it. If a man of education, who has health, eyes, hands, and leisure, wants an object, it is only because God Almighty has bestowed all these blessings upon a man who does not deserve them." Another way in which education may be prostituted is by employing it as a mere means of intellectual dissipation and amusement. Many are the ministers to this taste in our time. There is almost a mania for frivolity and excitement, which exhibits itself in many forms in our popular literature. To meet the public taste, our books and periodicals must now be highly spiced, amusing and comic, not disdaining slang, and illustrative of breaches of all laws, human and divine. Douglas Jerrold once observed of this tendency, "I am convinced the world will get tired, at least I hope so, of this eternal guffaw of all things. After all, life has something serious in it. It cannot be all a comic history of humanity. Some men would, I believe, write a comic sermon on the Mount. Think of a comic history of England, the drollery of Alfred, the fun of Sir Thomas More, the farce of his daughter, begging the dead head and clasping it in her coffin on her bosom. Surely the world will be sick of this blasphemy." John Sterling, in a like spirit, said, "Periodicals and novels are to all in this generation, but more especially to those whose minds are still unformed and in the process of formation, a new and more effectual substitute for the plagues of Egypt, vermin that corrupt the wholesome waters and infest our chambers." As a rest from toil and a relaxation from graver pursuits, the perusal of a well-written story by a writer of genius is a high intellectual pleasure, and it is a description of literature to which all classes of readers, old and young, are attracted as by a powerful instinct, nor would we have any of them debarred from its enjoyment in a reasonable degree. But to make it the exclusive literary diet, as some do, to devour the garbage with which the shelves of circulating libraries are filled, and to occupy the greater portion of the leisure hours in studying the preposterous pictures of human life which so many of them present, is worse than waste of time. It is positively pernicious. The habitual novel reader indulges in fictitious feelings so much that there is great risk of sound and healthy feeling becoming perverted or benumbed. "I never go to hear a tragedy," said a gay man once to the Archbishop of York. "It wears my heart out." The literary pity evoked by fiction leads to no corresponding action. The susceptibilities which it excites involve neither inconvenience nor self-sacrifice, so that the heart that is touched too often by the fiction may at length be insensible to the reality. The steel is gradually rubbed out of the character, and it insensibly loses its vital spring. "Drawing fine pictures of virtue in one's mind," said Bishop Butler, "is so far from necessarily or certainly conducive to form a habit of it in him who thus employs himself, that it may even harden the mind in a contrary course, and render it gradually more insensible." Amusement in moderation is wholesome and to be commended, but amusement in excess vitiates the whole nature and is a thing to be carefully guarded against. The maxim is often quoted of all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, but all play and no work makes him something greatly worse. Nothing can be more hurtful to a youth than to have his soul sodden with pleasure. The best qualities of his mind are impaired. Common enjoyments become tasteless. His appetite for the higher kind of pleasures is vitiated. And when he comes to face the work and the duties of life, the result is usually aversion and disgust. Fast men waste and exhaust the powers of life, and dry up the sources of true happiness. Having forestalled their spring, they can produce no healthy growth of either character or intellect. A child without simplicity, a maiden without innocence, a boy without truthfulness, are not more piteous sights than the man who has wasted and thrown away his youth in self-indulgence. Mirabeau said of himself, "My early years have already in a great measure disinherited the succeeding ones, and dissipated a great part of my vital powers." As the wrong done to another today returns upon ourselves tomorrow, so the sins of our youth rise up in our age to scourge us. When Lord Bacon says that strength of nature in youth passeth over many excesses which are owing a man until he is old, he exposes a physical as well as a moral fact which cannot be too well weighed in the conduct of life. "I assure you," wrote Giusti the Italian to a friend, "I pay a heavy price for existence. It is true that our lives are not at our own disposal. Nature pretends to give them gratis at the beginning, and then sends in her account." The worst of youthful indiscretions is, not that they destroy health, so much as that they sully manhood. The dissipated youth becomes a tainted man, and often he cannot be pure even if he would. If cure there be, it is only to be found in inoculating the mind with a fervent spirit of duty, and in energetic application to useful work. One of the most gifted of Frenchmen, in point of great intellectual endowments, was Benjamin Constant. But, blasé at 20, his life was only a prolonged wail, instead of a harvest of the great deeds which he was capable of accomplishing with ordinary diligence and self-control. He resolved upon doing so many things, which he never did, that people came to speak of him as Constant the Inconstant. He was a fluent and brilliant writer, and cherished the ambition of writing works which the world would not willingly let die. But whilst Constant affected the highest thinking, unhappily he practiced the lowest living. Nor did the transcendentalism of his books atone for the meanness of his life. He frequented the gaming tables while engaged in preparing his work upon religion, and carried on a disreputable intrigue while writing his Adolphe. With all his powers of intellect, he was powerless, because he had no faith in virtue. "Bah," said he, "what are honor and dignity? The longer I live, the more clearly I see there is nothing in them." It was the howl of a miserable man. He described himself as but ashes and dust. "I pass," said he, "like a shadow over the earth, accompanied by misery and ennui." He wished for Voltaire's energy, which he would rather have possessed than his genius. But he had no strength of purpose, nothing but wishes. His life, prematurely exhausted, had become but a heap of broken links. He spoke of himself as a person with one foot in the air. He admitted that he had no principles and no moral consistency. Hence, with his splendid talents, he contrived to do nothing, and after living many years miserable, he died, worn out and wretched. The career of Augustin Thierry, the author of the History of the Norman Conquest, affords an admirable contrast to that of Constant. His entire life presented a striking example of perseverance, diligence, self-culture, and untiring devotion to knowledge. In the pursuit he lost his eyesight, lost his health, but never lost his love of truth. When so feeble that he was carried from room to room like a helpless infant in the arms of a nurse, his brave spirit never failed him. And blind and helpless though he was, he concluded his literary career in the following noble words: "If, as I think, the interest of science is counted in the number of great national interests, I have given my country all that the soldier, mutilated on the field of battle, gives her. Whatever may be the fate of my labors, this example, I hope, will not be lost. I would wish it to serve to combat the species of moral weakness which is the disease of our present generation, to bring back into the straight road of life some of those enervated souls that complain of wanting faith, that know not what to do, and seek everywhere, without finding it, an object of worship and admiration. Why say with so much bitterness that in the world, constituted as it is, there is no air for all lungs, no employment for all minds? Is not calm and serious study there? And is not that a refuge, a hope, a field within the reach of all of us? With it, evil days are passed over without their weight being felt. Every one can make his own destiny. Every one employ his life nobly. This is what I have done, and would do again if I had to recommence my career. I would choose that which has brought me where I am. Blind and suffering without hope, and almost without intermission, I may give this testimony, which for me will not appear suspicious. There is something in the world better than sensual enjoyments, better than fortune, better than health itself. It is devotion to knowledge. End of section 29. Recording by Kat Din in Osaka, Japan. Self-Help, with Illustrations of Conduct and Perseverance, by Samuel Smiles. Section 30, Chapter 11, Self-Culture, Facilities and Difficulties, Part 3. Coleridge, in many respects, resembled Constant. He possessed equally brilliant powers, but was similarly infirm of purpose. With all his great intellectual gifts, he wanted the gift of industry, and was averse to continuous labor. He wanted also the sense of independence, and thought it no degradation to leave his wife and children to be maintained by the brain-work of the noble Southey, while he himself retired to Highgate Grove to discourse transcendentalism to his disciples, looking down contemptuously upon the honest work going forward beneath him amidst the din and smoke of London. With remunerative employment at his command, he stooped to accept the charity of friends, and notwithstanding his lofty ideas of philosophy, he condescended to humiliations from which many a day laborer would have shrunk. How different in spirit was Southey, laboring not merely at work of his own choice, and at task-work often tedious and distasteful, but also unremittingly, and with the utmost eagerness, seeking and storing knowledge purely for the love of it. Every day, every hour had its allotted employment, engagements to publishers requiring punctual fulfillment, the current expenses of a large household duty to provide, for Southey had no crop growing while his pen was idle. My ways, he used to say, are as broad as the king's high road, and my means lie in an inkstand. Robert Nicoll wrote to a friend, after reading the Recollections of Coleridge, "What a mighty intellect was lost in that man, for want of a little energy, a little determination." Nicoll himself was a true and brave spirit who died young, but not before he had encountered and overcome great difficulties in life. At his outset, while carrying on a small business as a bookseller, he found himself weighed down with a debt of only £20, which he said he felt weighing like a millstone round his neck, and that, if he had it paid, he never would borrow again from mortal man. Writing to his mother at the time, he said, "Fear not for me, dear mother, for I feel myself daily growing firmer and more hopeful in spirit. The more I think and reflect, and thinking, not reading, is now my occupation, I feel that, whether I be growing richer or not, I am growing a wiser man, which is far better. Pain, poverty, and all the other wild beasts of life which so affrighten others, I am so bold as to think I could look in the face without shrinking, without losing respect for myself, faith in man's high destinies, or trust in God. There is a point which it costs much mental toil and struggling to gain, but which, when once gained, a man can look down from, as a traveler from a lofty mountain, on storms raging below, while he is walking in sunshine. That I have yet gained this point in life I will not say, but I feel myself daily nearer to it. It is not ease, but effort, not facility, but difficulty, that makes men. There is, perhaps, no station in life in which difficulties have not to be encountered and overcome before any decided measure of success can be achieved. Those difficulties are, however, our best instructors, as our mistakes often form our best experience. Charles James Fox was accustomed to say that he hoped more from a man who failed and yet went on in spite of his failure than from the buoyant career of the successful. "It is all very well," said he, "to tell me that a young man has distinguished himself by a brilliant first speech. He may go on, or he may be satisfied with his first triumph. But show me a young man who has not succeeded at first, and nevertheless has gone on, and I will back that young man to do better than most of those who have succeeded at the first trial." We learn wisdom from failure much more than from success. We often discover what will do by finding out what will not do, and probably he who never made a mistake never made a discovery. It was the failure in the attempt to make a sucking pump act, when the working bucket was more than 33 feet above the surface of the water to be raised, that led observant men to study the law of atmospheric pressure, and opened a new field of research to the genius of Galileo, Torricelli, and Boyle. John Hunter used to remark that the art of surgery would not advance until professional men had the courage to publish their failures as well as their successes. Watt, the engineer, said, "Of all things most wanted in mechanical engineering was a history of failures. We want," he said, "a book of blots." When Sir Humphrey Davy was once shown a dexterously manipulated experiment, he said, "I thank God I was not made a dexterous manipulator, for the most important of my discoveries have been suggested to me by failures." Another distinguished investigator in physical science has left it on record that whenever in the course of his researches he encountered an apparently insuperable obstacle, he generally found himself on the brink of some discovery. The very greatest things, great thoughts, discoveries, inventions, have usually been nurtured in hardship, often pondered over in sorrow, and at length established with difficulty. Beethoven said of Rossini that he had in him the stuff to have made a good musician if he had only, when a boy, been well flogged, but that he had been spoilt by the facility with which he produced. Men who feel their strength within them need not fear to encounter adverse opinions. They have far greater reason to fear undue praise and too friendly criticism. When Mendelssohn was about to enter the orchestra at Birmingham, on the first performance of his Elijah, he said laughingly to one of his friends and critics, "Stick your claws into me. Don't tell me what you like, but what you don't like." It has been said, and truly, that it is the defeat that tries the general more than the victory. Washington lost more battles than he gained, but he succeeded in the end. The Romans, in their most victorious campaigns, almost invariably began with defeats. Moreau used to be compared by his companions to a drum, which nobody hears of except it be beaten. Wellington's military genius was perfected by encounter with difficulties of apparently the most overwhelming character, but which only served to nerve his resolution and bring out more prominently his great qualities as a man and a general. So the skillful mariner obtains his best experience amidst storms and tempests, which train him to self-reliance, courage, and the highest discipline, and we probably owe to rough seas and wintry nights the best training of our race of British seamen, who are, certainly, not surpassed by any in the world. Necessity may be a hard schoolmistress, but she is generally found the best. Though the ordeal of adversity is one from which we naturally shrink, yet, when it comes, we must bravely and manfully encounter it. Burns says truly, "Though losses and crosses be lessons right severe, there's wit there, you'll get there, you'll find no other where." Sweet indeed are the uses of adversity. They reveal to us our powers and call forth our energies. If there be real worth in the character, like sweet herbs, it will give forth its finest fragrance when pressed. Crosses, says the old proverb, are the ladders that lead to heaven. What is even poverty itself, asks Richter, that a man should murmur under it? It is but as the pain of piercing a maiden's ear, and you hang precious jewels in the wound. In the experience of life, it is found that the wholesome discipline of adversity in strong natures usually carries with it a self-preserving influence. Many are found capable of bravely bearing up under privations, and cheerfully encountering obstructions, who are afterwards found unable to withstand the more dangerous influences of prosperity. It is only a weak man whom the wind deprives of his cloak. A man of average strength is more in danger of losing it when assailed by the beams of a too genial sun. Thus, it often needs a higher discipline and a stronger character to bear up under good fortune than under adverse. Some generous natures kindle and warm with prosperity, but there are many on whom wealth has no such influence. Base hearts it only hardens, making those who were mean and servile mean and proud. But while prosperity is apt to harden the heart to pride, adversity in a man of resolution will serve to ripen it into fortitude. To use the words of Burke, difficulty is a severe instructor, set over us by the supreme ordinance of a parental guardian and instructor, who knows us better than we know ourselves, as he loves us better too. He that wrestles with us strengthens our nerves and sharpens our skill. Our antagonist is thus our helper. Without the necessity of encountering difficulty, life might be easier, but men would be worth less. For trials, wisely improved, train the character and teach self-help. Thus, hardship itself may often prove the wholesomest discipline for us, though we recognize it not. When the gallant young Hodson, unjustly removed from his Indian command, felt himself sore pressed down by unmerited calumny and reproach, he yet preserved the courage to say to a friend, "I strive to look the worst boldly in the face, as I would an enemy in the field, and to do my appointed work resolutely and to the best of my ability, satisfied that there is a reason for all, and that even irksome duties well done bring their own reward, and that, if not, still they are duties." The battle of life is, in most cases, fought uphill, and to win it without a struggle were perhaps to win it without honor. If there were no difficulties, there would be no success. If there were nothing to struggle for, there would be nothing to be achieved. Difficulties may intimidate the weak, but they act only as a wholesome stimulus to men of resolution and valor. All experience of life indeed serves to prove that the impediments thrown in the way of human advancement may, for the most part, be overcome by steady good conduct, honest zeal, activity, perseverance, and above all by a determined resolution to surmount difficulties and stand up manfully against misfortune. The school of difficulty is the best school of moral discipline for nations as for individuals. Indeed, the history of difficulty would be but a history of all the great and good things that have yet been accomplished by men. It is hard to say how much northern nations owe to their encounter with a comparatively rude and changeable climate and an originally sterile soil, which is one of the necessities of their condition, involving a perennial struggle with difficulties, such as the natives of sunnier climes know nothing of. And thus it may be that though our finest products are exotic, the skill and industry which have been necessary to rear them have issued in the production of a native growth of men not surpassed on the globe. Wherever there is difficulty, the individual man must come out for better or worse. Encounter with it will train his strength and discipline his skill, heartening him for future effort as the racer by being trained to run against the hill, at length courses with facility. The road to success may be steep to climb, and it puts to the proof the energies of him who would reach the summit. But by experience, a man soon learns that obstacles are to be overcome by grappling with them, that the nettle feels as soft as silk when it is boldly grasped, and that the most effective help towards realizing the object proposed is the moral conviction that we can and will accomplish it. Thus difficulties often fall away of themselves before the determination to overcome them. Much will be done if we do but try. Nobody knows what he can do till he has tried, and few try their best till they have been forced to do it. "If I could do such and such a thing," says the desponding youth. But nothing will be done if he only wishes. The desire must ripen into purpose and effort, and one energetic attempt is worth 1,000 aspirations. It is these thorny ifs, the mutterings of impotence and despair, which so often hedge round the field of possibility, and prevent anything being done or even attempted. "A difficulty," said Lord Lyndhurst, "is a thing to be overcome. Grapple with it at once. Facility will come with practice, and strength and fortitude with repeated effort." Thus the mind and character may be trained to an almost perfect discipline, and enabled to act with a grace, spirit, and liberty almost incomprehensible to those who have not passed through a similar experience. Everything that we learn is the mastery of a difficulty, and the mastery of one helps to the mastery of others. Things which may at first sight appear comparatively valueless in education, such as the study of the dead languages and the relations of lines and surfaces, which we call mathematics, are really of the greatest practical value, not so much because of the information which they yield, as because of the development which they compel. The mastery of these studies evokes effort, and cultivates powers of application which otherwise might have lain dormant. Thus, one thing leads to another, and so the work goes on through life, encounter with difficulty ending only when life and culture end. But indulging in the feeling of discouragement never helped anyone over a difficulty, and never will. D'Alembert's advice to the student who complained to him about his want of success in mastering the first elements of mathematics was the right one. Go on, sir, and faith and strength will come to you. The danseuse who turns a pirouette, the violinist who plays a sonata, have acquired their dexterity by patient repetition and after many failures. Carissimi, when praised for the ease and grace of his melodies, exclaimed, "Ah, you little know with what difficulty this ease has been acquired." Sir Joshua Reynolds, when once asked how long it had taken him to paint a certain picture, replied, "All my life." Henry Clay, the American orator, when giving advice to young men, thus described to them the secret of his success in the cultivation of his art. "I owe my success in life," said he, "chiefly to one circumstance, that at the age of 27 I commenced, and continued for years, the process of daily reading and speaking upon the contents of some historical or scientific book. These offhand efforts were made, sometimes in a cornfield, at others in the forest, and not unfrequently in some distant barn, with the horse and the ox for my auditors. It is to this early practice of the art of all arts that I am indebted for the primary and leading impulses that stimulated me onward and have shaped and molded my whole subsequent destiny." Curran, the Irish orator, when a youth, had a strong defect in his articulation, and at school he was known as Stuttering Jack Curran. While he was engaged in the study of law and still struggling to overcome his defect, he was stung into eloquence by the sarcasms of a member of a debating club, who characterized him as Orator Mum, for, like Cowper, when he stood up to speak on a previous occasion, Curran had not been able to utter a word. The taunt stung him, and he replied in a triumphant speech. This accidental discovery in himself of the gift of eloquence encouraged him to proceed in his studies with renewed energy. He corrected his enunciation by reading aloud, emphatically and distinctly, the best passages in literature, for several hours every day, studying his features before a mirror, and adopting a method of gesticulation suited to his rather awkward and ungraceful figure. He also proposed cases to himself, which he argued with as much care as if he had been addressing a jury. Curran began business with the qualification which Lord Eldon stated to be the first requisite for distinction, that is, to be not worth a shilling. While working his way laboriously at the bar, still oppressed by the diffidence which had overcome him in his debating club, he was on one occasion provoked by the Judge Robinson into making a very severe retort. In the case under discussion, Curran observed that he had never met the law as laid down by his lordship in any book in his library. "That may be, sir," said the judge in a contemptuous tone, "but I suspect that your library is very small." His lordship was notoriously a furious political partisan, the author of several anonymous pamphlets characterized by unusual violence and dogmatism. Curran, roused by the allusion to his straitened circumstances, replied thus: "It is very true, my lord, that I am poor, and the circumstance has certainly curtailed my library. My books are not numerous, but they are select, and I hope they have been perused with proper dispositions. I have prepared myself for this high profession by the study of a few good works, rather than by the composition of a great many bad ones. I am not ashamed of my poverty, but I should be ashamed of my wealth, could I have stooped to acquire it by servility and corruption. If I rise not to rank, I shall at least be honest, and should I ever cease to be so, many an example shows me that an ill-gained elevation, by making me the more conspicuous, would only make me the more universally and the more notoriously contemptible." The extremest poverty has been no obstacle in the way of men devoted to the duty of self-culture. Professor Alexander Murray, the linguist, learnt to write by scribbling his letters on an old wool card with the end of a burnt heather stem. The only book which his father, who was a poor shepherd, possessed, was a penny shorter catechism, but that, being thought too valuable for common use, was carefully preserved in a cupboard for the Sunday catechisings. Professor Moore, when a young man, being too poor to purchase Newton's Principia, borrowed the book, and copied the whole of it with his own hand. Many poor students, while laboring daily for their living, have only been able to snatch an atom of knowledge here and there at intervals, as birds do their food in winter-time, when the fields are covered with snow. They have struggled on, and faith and hope have come to them. A well-known author and publisher, William Chambers of Edinburgh, speaking before an assemblage of young men in that city, thus briefly described to them his humble beginnings for their encouragement. "I stand before you," he said, "a self-educated man. My education was that which is supplied at the humble parish schools of Scotland, and it was only when I went to Edinburgh, a poor boy, that I devoted my evenings, after the labours of the day, to the cultivation of that intellect which the Almighty has given me. From 7 or 8 in the morning till 9 or 10 at night was I at my business as a bookseller's apprentice, and it was only during hours after these, stolen from sleep, that I could devote myself to study. I did not read novels. My attention was devoted to physical science and other useful matters. I also taught myself French. I look back to those times with great pleasure, and am almost sorry I have not to go through the same experience again, for I reaped more pleasure when I had not a sixpence in my pocket, studying in a garret in Edinburgh, than I now find when sitting amidst all the elegancies and comforts of a parlour. William Cobbett's account of how he learnt English grammar is full of interest and instruction for all students labouring under difficulties. "I learned grammar," said he, "when I was a private soldier on the pay of 6 pence a day. The edge of my berth, or that of my guard-bed, was my seat to study in. My knapsack was my bookcase. A bit of board lying on my lap was my writing-table, and the task did not demand anything like a year of my life. I had no money to purchase candle or oil. In winter-time it was rarely that I could get any evening light but that of the fire, and only my turn even of that. And if I, under such circumstances, and without parent or friend to advise or encourage me, accomplished this undertaking, what excuse can there be for any youth, however poor, however pressed with business, or however circumstanced as to room or other conveniences? To buy a pen or a sheet of paper I was compelled to forego some portion of food, though in a state of half-starvation. I had no moment of time that I could call my own, and I had to read and to write amidst the talking, laughing, singing, whistling, and brawling of at least half a score of the most thoughtless of men, and that, too, in the hours of their freedom from all control. Think not lightly of the farthing that I had to give, now and then, for ink, pen, or paper. That farthing was, alas, a great sum to me. I was as tall as I am now. I had great health and great exercise. The whole of the money not expended for us at market was 2 pence a week for each man. I remember, and well I may, that on one occasion I, after all necessary expenses, had, on a Friday, made shifts to have a halfpenny in reserve, which I had destined for the purchase of a red herring in the morning. But when I pulled off my clothes at night, so hungry then as to be hardly able to endure life, I found that I had lost my halfpenny. I buried my head under the miserable sheet and rug and cried like a child. And again I say, if I, under circumstances like these, could encounter and overcome this task, can there be, in the whole world, a youth to find an excuse for the non-performance? End of section 30. Recording by Kat Din in Osaka, Japan. Self-Help, with Illustrations of Conduct and Perseverance, by Samuel Smiles. Section 31, Chapter 11, Self-Culture, Facilities and Difficulties, Part 4. We have been informed of an equally striking instance of perseverance and application in learning on the part of a French political exile in London. His original occupation was that of a stone mason, at which he found employment for some time, but work becoming slack, he lost his place, and poverty stared him in the face. In his dilemma, he called upon a fellow exile profitably engaged in teaching French, and consulted him what he ought to do to earn a living. The answer was, "Become a professor." "A professor?" answered the mason. "I, who am only a workman, speaking but a patois. Surely you are jesting." "On the contrary, I am quite serious," said the other, "and again I advise you, become a professor. Place yourself under me, and I will undertake to teach you how to teach others." No, replied the mason. "It is impossible. I am too old to learn. I am too little of a scholar. I cannot be a professor." He went away, and again he tried to obtain employment at his trade. From London he went into the provinces, and travelled several hundred miles in vain. He could not find a master. Returning to London, he went direct to his former adviser, and said, "I have tried everywhere for work and failed. I will now try to be a professor." He immediately placed himself under instruction, and being a man of close application, of quick apprehension, and vigorous intelligence, he speedily mastered the elements of grammar, the rules of construction and composition, and, what he had still in great measure to learn, the correct pronunciation of classical French. When his friend and instructor thought him sufficiently competent to undertake the teaching of others, an appointment, advertised as vacant, was applied for and obtained, and behold, our artisan at length become professor. It so happened that the seminary to which he was appointed was situated in a suburb of London, where he had formerly worked as a stonemason, and every morning the first thing which met his eyes on looking out of his dressing-room window was a stack of cottage chimneys which he had himself built. He feared for a time lest he should be recognized in the village as the quondam workman, and thus bring discredit on a seminary which was of high standing. But he need have been under no such apprehension, as he proved a most efficient teacher, and his pupils were on more than one occasion publicly complimented for their knowledge of French. Meanwhile, he secured the respect and friendship of all who knew him, fellow professors as well as pupils, and when the story of his struggles, his difficulties, and his past history became known to them, they admired him more than ever. Sir Samuel Romilly was not less indefatigable as a self-cultivator. The son of a jeweller, descended from a French refugee, he received little education in his early years, but overcame all his disadvantages by unwearied application, and by efforts constantly directed towards the same end. I determined, he says in his autobiography, when I was between 15 and 16 years of age, to apply myself seriously to learning Latin, of which I, at the time, knew little more than some of the most familiar rules of grammar. In the course of 3 or 4 years, during which I thus applied myself, I had read almost every prose writer of the age of pure Latinity, except those who have treated merely of technical subjects, such as Varro, Columella, and Celsus. I had gone 3 times through the whole of Livy, Sallust, and Tacitus. I had studied the most celebrated orations of Cicero, and translated a great deal of Homer. Terence, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and Juvenal I had read over and over again. He also studied geography, natural history, and natural philosophy, and obtained a considerable acquaintance with general knowledge. At 16 he was articled to a clerk in Chancery, worked hard, was admitted to the bar, and his industry and perseverance ensured success. He became Solicitor General under the Fox administration in 1806, and steadily worked his way to the highest celebrity in his profession. Yet he was always haunted by a painful and almost oppressive sense of his own disqualifications, and never ceased laboring to remedy them. His autobiography is a lesson of instructive facts, worth volumes of sentiment, and well deserves a careful perusal. Sir Walter Scott was accustomed to cite the case of his young friend John Leyden as one of the most remarkable illustrations of the power of perseverance which he had ever known. The son of a shepherd in one of the wildest valleys of Roxburghshire, he was almost entirely self-educated. Like many Scotch shepherds' sons, like Hogg, who taught himself to write by copying the letters of a printed book as he lay watching his flock on the hillside, like Cans, who, from tending sheep on the Lammermoors, raised himself by dint of application and industry to the professor's chair which he now so worthily holds. Like Murray, Ferguson, and many more, Leyden was early inspired by a thirst for knowledge. When a poor bare-footed boy, he walked 6 or 8 miles across the moors daily to learn reading at the little village schoolhouse of Kirkton. And this was all the education he received. The rest he acquired for himself. He found his way to Edinburgh to attend the college there, setting the extremest penury at defiance. He was first discovered as a frequenter of a small bookseller's shop kept by Archibald Constable, afterwards so well known as the publisher. He would pass hour after hour perched on a ladder in mid-air, with some great folio in his hand, forgetful of the scanty meal of bread and water which awaited him at his miserable lodging. Access to books and lectures comprised all within the bounds of his wishes. Thus he toiled and battled at the gates of science until his unconquerable perseverance carried everything before it. Before he had attained his 19th year, he had astonished all the professors in Edinburgh by his profound knowledge of Greek and Latin, and the general mass of information he had acquired. Having turned his views to India, he sought employment in the civil service, but failed. He was, however, informed that a surgeon's assistant's commission was open to him. But he was no surgeon, and knew no more of the profession than a child. He could, however, learn. Then he was told he must be ready to pass in 6 months. Nothing daunted, he set to work to acquire in 6 months what usually required 3 years. At the end of 6 months he took his degree with honor. Scott and a few friends helped to fit him out, and he sailed for India, after publishing his beautiful poem, The Scenes of Infancy. In India, he promised to become one of the greatest of Oriental scholars. but was unhappily cut off by fever caught by exposure and died at an early age. The life of the late Dr. Lee, professor of Hebrew at Cambridge, furnishes one of the most remarkable instances in modern times of the power of patient perseverance and resolute purpose in working out an honorable career in literature. He received his education at a charity school at Lognor, near Shrewsbury, but so little distinguished himself there that his master pronounced him one of the dullest boys that ever passed through his hands. He was put apprentice to a carpenter, and worked at that trade until he arrived at manhood. To occupy his leisure hours he took to reading, and some of the books containing Latin quotations he became desirous of ascertaining what they meant. He bought a Latin grammar, and proceeded to learn Latin. As Stone, the Duke of Argyll's gardener, said long before, does one need to know anything more than the 24 letters in order to learn everything else that one wishes? Lee rose early and sat up late, and he succeeded in mastering the Latin before his apprenticeship was out. Whilst working one day in some place of worship, a copy of a Greek Testament fell in his way, and he was immediately filled with a desire to learn that language. He accordingly sold some of his Latin books and purchased a Greek grammar and lexicon. Taking pleasure in learning, he soon mastered the language. Then he sold his Greek books and bought Hebrew ones and learnt that language, unassisted by any instructor, without any hope of fame or reward, but simply following the bent of his genius. He next proceeded to learn the Chaldee, Syriac, and Samaritan dialects. But his studies began to tell upon his health, and brought on disease in his eyes through his long night watchings with his books. Having laid them aside for a time and recovered his health, he went on with his daily work. His character as a tradesman being excellent, his business improved, and his means enabled him to marry, which he did when 28 years old. He determined now to devote himself to the maintenance of his family, and to renounce the luxury of literature. Accordingly, he sold all his books. He might have continued a working carpenter all his life, had not the chest of tools upon which he depended for subsistence been destroyed by fire, and destitution stared him in the face. He was too poor to buy new tools, so he bethought him of teaching children their letters, a profession requiring the least possible capital. But though he had mastered many languages, he was so defective in the common branches of knowledge that at first he could not teach them. Resolute of purpose, however, he assiduously set to work, and taught himself arithmetic and writing to such a degree as to be able to impart the knowledge of these branches to little children. His unaffected, simple, and beautiful character gradually attracted friends, and the acquirements of the learned carpenter became bruited abroad. Dr. Scott, a neighbouring clergyman, obtained for him the appointment of master of a charity school in Shrewsbury, and introduced him to a distinguished Oriental scholar. These friends supplied him with books, and Lee successively mastered Arabic, Persic, and Hindustani. He continued to pursue his studies while on duty as a private in the local militia of the county, gradually acquiring greater proficiency in languages. At length his kind patron Dr. Scott enabled Lee to enter Queen's College, Cambridge, and after a course of study in which he distinguished himself by his mathematical acquirements, a vacancy occurring in the professorship of Arabic and Hebrew, he was worthily elected to fill the honorable office. Besides ably performing his duties as a professor, he voluntarily gave much of his time to the instruction of missionaries going forth to preach the gospel to Eastern tribes in their own tongue. He also made translations of the Bible into several Asiatic dialects, and having mastered the New Zealand language, he arranged a grammar and vocabulary for 2 New Zealand chiefs who were then in England, which books are now in daily use in the New Zealand schools. Such, in brief, is the remarkable history of Dr. Samuel Lee, and it is but the counterpart of numerous similarly instructive examples of the power of perseverance in self-culture, as displayed in the lives of many of the most distinguished of our literary and scientific men. There are many other illustrious names which might be cited to prove the truth of the common saying that it is never too late to learn. Even at advanced years men can do much, if they will determine on making a beginning. Sir Henry Spelman did not begin the study of science until he was between 50 and 60 years of age. Franklin was 50 before he fully entered upon the study of natural philosophy. Dryden and Scott were not known as authors until each was in his 40th year. Boccaccio was 35 when he commenced his literary career, and Alfieri was 46 when he began the study of Greek. Dr. Arnold learned German at an advanced age for the purpose of reading Niebuhr in the original. And in like manner, James Watt, when about 40, while working at his trade of an instrument maker in Glasgow, learned French, German, and Italian to enable himself to peruse the valuable works on mechanical philosophy which existed in those languages. Thomas Scott was 56 before he began to learn Hebrew. Robert Hall was once found lying upon the floor, racked by pain, learning Italian in his old age, to enable him to judge of the parallel drawn by Macaulay between Milton and Dante. Handel was 48 before he published any of his great works. Indeed, hundreds of instances might be given of men who struck out an entirely new path and successfully entered on new studies at a comparatively advanced time of life. None but the frivolous or the indolent will say, "I am too old to learn." And here we would repeat what we have said before, that it is not men of genius who move the world and take the lead in it, so much as men of steadfastness, purpose, and indefatigable industry. Notwithstanding the many undeniable instances of the precocity of men of genius, it is nevertheless true that early cleverness gives no indication of the height to which the grown man will reach. Precocity is sometimes a symptom of disease rather than of intellectual vigor. What becomes of all the remarkably clever children? Where are the Dukeses and prize boys? Trace them through life, and it will frequently be found that the dull boys who were beaten at school have shot ahead of them. The clever boys are rewarded, but the prizes which they gain by their greater quickness and facility do not always prove of use to them. What ought rather to be rewarded is the endeavor, the struggle, and the obedience. For it is the youth who does his best, though endowed with an inferiority of natural powers, that ought above all others to be encouraged. An interesting chapter might be written on the subject of illustrious dunces, dull boys, but brilliant men. We have room, however, for only a few instances. Pietro de Cortona, the painter, was thought so stupid that he was nicknamed Ass's Head when a boy, and Tommaso Guidi was generally known as Heavy Tom, Masaccio Tomasaccio, though by diligence he afterwards raised himself to the highest eminence. Newton, when at school, stood at the bottom of the lowest form but one. The boy above Newton having kicked him, the dunce showed his pluck by challenging him to a fight, and beat him. Then he set to work with a will, and determined also to vanquish his antagonist as a scholar, which he did, rising to the top of his class. Many of our greatest divines have been anything but precocious. Isaac Barrow, when a boy at the Charterhouse School, was notorious chiefly for his strong temper, pugnacious habits, and proverbial idleness as a scholar, and he caused such grief to his parents that his father used to say that if it pleased God to take from him any of his children, he hoped it might be Isaac, the least promising of them all. Adam Clark, when a boy, was proclaimed by his father to be a grievous dunce, though he could roll large stones about. Dean Swift was plucked at Dublin University, and only obtained his recommendation to Oxford speciali gratia. The well-known Dr. Chalmers and Dr. Cook were boys together at the parish school of St. Andrews, and they were found so stupid and mischievous that the master, irritated beyond measure, dismissed them both as incorrigible dunces. The brilliant Sheridan showed so little capacity as a boy that he was presented to a tutor by his mother with a complimentary accompaniment that he was an incorrigible dunce. Walter Scott was all but a dunce when a boy, always much readier for a bicker than apt at his lessons. At the Edinburgh University, Professor Dalzell pronounced upon him the sentence that dunce he was, and dunce he would remain. Chatterton was returned on his mother's hands as a fool of whom nothing could be made. Burns was a dull boy, good only at athletic exercises. Goldsmith spoke of himself as a plant that flowered late. Alfieri left college no wiser than he entered it, and did not begin the studies by which he distinguished himself until he had run half over Europe. Robert Clive was a dunce, if not a reprobate, when a youth, but always full of energy, even in badness. His family, glad to get rid of him, shipped him off to Madras, and he lived to lay the foundations of the British power in India. Napoleon and Wellington were both dull boys, not distinguishing themselves in any way at school. Of the former, the Duchess de Brontes says, "He had good health, but was in other respects like other boys." Ulysses Grant, the commander-in-chief of the United States, was called Useless Grant by his mother. He was so dull and unhandy when a boy. And Stonewall Jackson, Lee's greatest lieutenant, was in his youth chiefly noted for his slowness. While a pupil at West Point Military Academy, he was, however, equally remarkable for his indefatigable application and perseverance. When a task was set him, he never left it until he had mastered it, nor did he ever feign to possess knowledge which he had not entirely acquired. Again and again, wrote one who knew him, when called upon to answer questions in the recitation of the day, he would reply, "I have not yet looked at it. I have been engaged in mastering the recitation of yesterday or the day before." The result was that he graduated 17th in a class of 70. There was probably in the whole class not a boy to whom Jackson at the outset was not inferior in knowledge and attainments, but at the end of the race he had only 16 before him, and had outstripped no fewer than 53. It used to be said of him by his contemporaries that if the course had been for 10 years instead of 4, Jackson would have graduated at the head of his class. John Howard, the philanthropist, was another illustrious dunce, learning next to nothing during the 7 years that he was at school. Stevenson, as a youth, was distinguished chiefly for his skill at putting and wrestling and attention to his work. The brilliant Sir Humphrey Davy was no cleverer than other boys. His teacher, Dr. Cardew, once said of him, "While he was with me, I could not discern the faculties by which he was so much distinguished." Indeed, Davy himself in after life considered it fortunate that he had been left to enjoy so much idleness at school. Watt was a dull scholar, notwithstanding the stories told about his precocity, but he was, what was better, patient and perseverant, and it was by such qualities and by his carefully cultivated inventiveness that he was enabled to perfect his steam engine. What Dr. Arnold said of boys is equally true of men, that the difference between one boy and another consists not so much in talent as in energy. Given perseverance and energy soon becomes habitual. Provided the dunce has persistency and application, he will inevitably head the cleverer fellow without those qualities. Slow but sure wins the race. It is perseverance that explains how the position of boys at school is so often reversed in real life, and it is curious to note how some of who were then so clever have since become so commonplace, whilst others, dull boys, of whom nothing was expected, slow in their faculties but sure in their pace, have assumed the position of leaders of men. The author of this book, when a boy, stood in the same class with one of the greatest of dunces. One teacher after another had tried his skill upon him and failed. Corporal punishment, the fool's cap, coaxing, and earnest entreaty proved alike fruitless. Sometimes the experiment was tried of putting him at the top of his class, and it was curious to note the rapidity with which he gravitated to the inevitable bottom. The youth was given up by his teachers as an incorrigible dunce, one of them pronouncing him to be a stupendous booby. Yet, slow though he was, this dunce had a sort of dull energy of purpose in him, which grew with his muscles and his manhood. And, strange to say, when he at length came to take part in the practical business of life, he was found heading most of his school companions, and eventually left the greater number of them far behind. The last time the author heard of him, he was chief magistrate of his native town. The tortoise in the right road will beat a racer in the wrong. It matters not though a youth be slow, if he be but diligent. Quickness of parts may even prove a defect, inasmuch as the boy who learns readily will often forget as readily, and also because he finds no need of cultivating that quality of application and perseverance which the slower youth is compelled to exercise, and which proves so valuable an element in the formation of every character. Davy said, "What I am I have made myself," and the same holds true universally. To conclude, the best culture is not obtained from teachers when at school or college, so much as by our own diligent self-education when we have become men. Hence, parents need not be in too great haste to see their children's talents forced into bloom. Let them watch and wait patiently, letting good example and quiet training do their work, and leave the rest to Providence. Let them see to it that the youth is provided, by free exercise of his bodily powers, with a full stock of physical health. Set him fairly on the road of self-culture, carefully train his habits of application and perseverance, and as he grows older, if the right stuff be in him, he will be enabled vigorously and effectively to cultivate himself. End of section 31. Recording by Kat Din in Osaka, Japan.
Self-Help with Illustrations of Conduct and Perseverance by Samuel Smiles. Examples, Models, Part 1. Ever their phantoms rise before us, our loftier brothers, but one in blood. By bed and table they lord it o'er us, with looks of beauty and words of good. John Sterling. Children may be strangled, but deeds never. They have an indestructible life both in and out of our consciousness. George Eliot. There is no action of man in this life which is not the beginning of so long a chain of consequences as that no human providence is high enough to give us a prospect to the end. Thomas of Malmesbury. Example is one of the most potent of instructors, though it teaches without a tongue. It is the practical school of mankind, working by action, which is always more forcible than words. Precept may point to us the way, but it is silent, continuous example, conveyed to us by habits, and living with us in fact, that carries us along. Good advice has its weight, but without the accompaniment of a good example, it is of comparatively small influence, and it will be found that the common saying of "do as I say, not as I do," is usually reversed in the actual experience of life. All persons are more or less apt to learn through the eye rather than the ear, and whatever is seen in fact makes a far deeper impression than anything that is merely read or heard. This is especially the case in early youth, when the eye is the chief inlet of knowledge. Whatever children see, they unconsciously imitate. They insensibly come to resemble those who are about them, as insects take the color of the leaves they feed on. Hence the vast importance of domestic training. For whatever may be the efficiency of schools, the example set in our homes must always be of vastly greater influence in forming the characters of our future men and women. The home is the crystal of society, the nucleus of national character, and from that source, be it pure or tainted, issue the habits, principles, and maxims which govern public as well as private life. The nation comes from the nursery. Public opinion itself is for the most part the outgrowth of the home, and the best philanthropy comes from the fireside. "To love the little platoon we belong to in society," says Burke, "is the germ of all public affections." From this little central spot, the human sympathies may extend in an ever-widening circle until the world is embraced. For though true philanthropy, like charity, begins at home, assuredly it does not end there. Example in conduct, therefore, even in apparently trivial matters, is of no light moment, inasmuch as it is constantly becoming interwoven with the lives of others and contributing to form their natures for better or for worse. The characters of parents are thus constantly repeated in their children, and the acts of affection, discipline, industry, and self-control, which they daily exemplify, live and act when all else which may have been learned through the ear has long been forgotten. Hence a wise man was accustomed to speak of his children as his future state. Even the mute action and unconscious look of a parent may give a stamp to the character which is never effaced. And who can tell how much evil act has been stayed by the thought of some good parent, whose memory their children may not sully by the commission of an unworthy deed or the indulgence of an impure thought. The veriest trifles thus become of importance in influencing the characters of men. "A kiss from my mother," said West, "made me a painter." It is on the direction of such seeming trifles when children that the future happiness and success of men mainly depend. Val Buxton, when occupying an eminent and influential station in life, wrote to his mother, "I constantly feel, especially in action and exertion for others, the effects of principles early implanted by you in my mind." Buxton was also accustomed to remember with gratitude the obligations which he owed to an illiterate man, a gamekeeper, named Abraham Plaistow, with whom he played and rode and sported, a man who could neither read nor write, but was full of natural good sense and mother wit. "What made him particularly valuable," says Buxton, "were his principles of integrity and honor. He never said or did a thing in the absence of my mother of which she would have disapproved. He always held up the highest standard of integrity and filled our useful minds with sentiments as pure and as generous as could be found in the writings of Seneca or Cicero. Such was my first instructor, and, I must add, my best." Lord Langdale, looking back upon the admirable example set him by his mother, declared, "If the whole world were put into one scale and my mother into the other, the world would kick the beam." Mrs. Schimmelpenninck, in her old age, was accustomed to call to mind the personal influences exercised by her mother upon the society amidst which she moved. When she entered a room, it had the effect of immediately raising the tone of the conversation, and as of purifying the moral atmosphere, all seeming to breathe more freely and stand more erectly. "In her presence," says the daughter, "I became for the time transformed into another person." So much does the moral health depend upon the moral atmosphere that is breathed, and so great is the influence daily exercised by parents over their children by living a life before their eyes, that perhaps the best system of parental instruction might be summed up in these two words: improve thyself. There is something solemn and awful in the thought that there is not an act done or a word uttered by a human being but carries with it a train of consequences, the end of which we may never trace. Not one but, to a certain extent, gives a color to our life and insensibly influences the lives of those about us. The good deed or word will live, even though we may not see it fructify, but so will the bad, and no person is so insignificant as to be sure that his example will not do good on one hand or evil on the other. The spirit of men do not die. They still live and walk abroad among us. It was a fine and true thought uttered by Mr. Disraeli in the House of Commons on the death of Richard Cobden that, "he was one of those men who, though not present, were still members of that House, who were independent of disillusions, of the caprices of constituencies, and even of the course of time." There is, indeed, an essence of immortality in the life of man, even in this world. No individual in the universe stands alone. He is a component part of a system of mutual dependencies, and by his several acts he either increases or diminishes the sum of human good now and forever. As the present is rooted in the past, and the lives and examples of our forefathers still to a great extent influence us, so are we, by our daily acts, contributing to form the condition and character of the future. Man is a fruit formed and ripened by the culture of all the foregoing centuries, and the living generation continues the magnetic current of action and example destined to bind the remotest past with the most distant future. No man's acts die utterly, and though his body may resolve into dust and air, his good or his bad deeds will still be bringing forth fruit after their kind and influencing further generations for all time to come. It is in this momentous and solemn fact that the great peril and responsibility of human existence lies. Mr. Babbage has so powerfully expressed this idea in a noble passage in one of his writings that we here venture to quote his words. "Every atom," he says, "impressed with good or ill, retains at once the motions which philosophers and sages have imparted to it, mixed and combined in 10,000 ways with all that is worthless and base. The air itself is one vast library, on whose pages are written forever all that man has ever said or whispered. There, in their immutable but unerring characters, mixed with the earliest as well as the latest sighs of mortality, stand forever recorded vows unredeemed, promises unfulfilled, perpetuating in the united movements of each particle the testimony of man's changeful will. But if the air we breathe is the never-failing historian of the sentiments we have uttered, earth, air, and ocean are, in like manner, the eternal witnesses of the acts we have done. The same principle of the equality of action and reaction applies to them. No motion impressed by natural causes or by human agency is ever obliterated. If the Almighty stamped on the brow of the first murderer the indelible and visible mark of his guilt, he has also established laws by which every succeeding criminal is not less irrevocably chained to the testimony of his crime. For every atom of his mortal frame, through whatever changes his severed particles may migrate, will still retain, adhering to it, through every combination, some movement derived from that very muscular effort by which the crime itself was perpetrated." Thus, every act we do or word we utter, as well as every act we witness or word we hear, carries with it an influence which extends over and gives us color, not only to the whole of our future life, but makes itself felt upon the whole frame of society. We may not, and indeed cannot possibly, trace the influence working itself into action in its various ramifications amongst our children, our friends, or associates. Yet there it is assuredly working on forever. And herein lies the great significance of setting forth a good example, a silent teaching which even the poorest and least significant person can practice in his daily life. There is no one so humble but that he owes to others this simple but priceless instruction. Even the meanest condition may thus be made useful, for the light set in a low place shines as faithfully as that set upon a hill. Everywhere and under almost all circumstances, however externally adverse, in moorland shylings, in cottage hamlets, in the close alleys of great towns, the true man may grow. He who tills a space of earth scarce bigger than is needed for his grave may work as faithfully and to as good purpose as the heir to thousands. The commonest workshop may thus be a school of industry, science, and good morals on the one hand, or of idleness, folly, and depravity on the other. It all depends on the individual men, and the use they make of the opportunities for good which offer themselves. A life well spent, a character uprightly sustained, is no slight legacy to leave to one's children and to the world, for it is the most eloquent lesson of virtue and severest reproof of vice, while it continues an enduring source of the best kind of riches. Well for those who can say, as Pope did, in rejoinder to the sarcasm of Lord Hervey, quote, "I think it is enough that my parents, such as they were, never cost me a blush, and that their son, such as he is, never cost them a tear." End quote. It is not enough to tell others what they are to do, but to exhibit the actual example of doing. What Mrs. Chisholm described to Mrs. Stowe as a secret of her success applies to all life. Quote, "I found," she said, "that if we want anything done, we must go to work and do. It is of no use merely to talk, none whatever." End quote. It is poor eloquence that only shows how a person can talk. Had Mrs. Chisholm rested, satisfied with lecturing, her project, she was persuaded, would never have got beyond the region of talk. But when people saw what she was doing and had actually accomplished, they fell in with her views and came forward to help her. Hence, the most beneficent worker is not he who says the most eloquent things, or even who thinks the most loftily, but he who does the most eloquent acts. True-hearted persons, even in the humblest station in life, who are energetic doers, may thus give an impulse to good works out of all proportion, apparently, to their actual station in society. Thomas Wright might have talked about the reclamation of criminals, and John Pounds about the necessity for ragged schools, and yet done nothing. Instead of which, they simply set to work without any other idea in their minds than that of doing, not talking. and how the example of even the poorest man may tell upon society, hear what Dr. Guthrie, the apostle of the Ragged School movement, says of the influence which the example of John Pounds, the humble Portsmouth cobbler, exercised upon his own working career. Quote, "The interest I have been led to take in this cause is an example of how, in Providence, a man's destiny, his course of life, like that of a river, may be determined and affected by very trivial circumstances. It is rather curious, at least it is interesting to me to remember, that it was by a picture I was first led to take an interest in Ragged Schools, by a picture in an old, obscure, decaying borough that stands on the shores of the Firth of Forth, the birthplace of Thomas Chalmers. I went to see this place many years ago, and going into the inn for refreshment, I found the room covered with pictures of shepherdesses at their crooks, and sailors in holiday attire, not particularly interesting. But above the chimney-piece there was a large print, more respectable than its neighbors, which represented a cobbler's room. The cobbler was there himself, spectacles on his nose, an old shoe between his knees, the massive forehead and firm mouth indicating great determination of character, and beneath his bushy eyebrows benevolence gleamed out on a number of poor ragged boys and girls who stood at their lessons around the busy cobbler. My curiosity was awakened, and in the inscription I read how this man, John Pounds, a cobbler in Portsmouth, taking pity on the multitude of poor ragged children left by ministers and magistrates, and ladies and gentlemen, to go to ruin on the streets, how, like a good shepherd, he gathered in these wretched outcasts, how he had trained them to God and to the world, and how, while earning his daily bread by the sweat of his brow, he had rescued from misery and saved to society not less than 500 of these children. I felt ashamed of myself. I felt reproved for the little I had done. My feelings were touched. I was astonished at this man's achievements, and I well remember, in the enthusiasm of the moment, saying to my companion, (and I have seen in my cooler and calmer moments no reason for unsaying the saying), that man is an honor to humanity and deserves the tallest monument ever raised within the shores of Britain. I took up that man's history, and I found it animated by the spirit of him who had compassion on the multitude. John Pounds was a clever man besides, and, like Paul, if he could not win a poor boy any other way, he won him by art. He would be seen chasing a ragged boy along the quays and compelling him to come to school, not by the power of a policeman, but by the power of a hot potato. He knew the love an Irishman had for a potato, and John Pounds might be seen running, holding under the boy's nose a potato, like an Irishman, very hot, and with a coat as ragged as himself. When the day comes when honor will be done to whom honor is due, I can fancy the crowd of those whose fame poets have sung, and to whose memory monuments have been raised, dividing like the wave, and passing the great and the noble and the mighty of the land, this poor, obscure old man, stepping forward and receiving the especial notice of him who said, "Inasmuch as ye did it unto one of the least of these, ye did it also to me." End quote. The education of character is very much a question of models. We mold ourselves so unconsciously after the characters, manners, habits, and opinions of those who are about us. Good rules may do much, but good models far more. For in the latter we have instruction in action, wisdom at work. Good admonition and bad example only build with one hand to pull down with the other. Hence the vast importance of exercising great care in the selection of companions, especially in youth. There is a magnetic affinity in young persons which insensibly tends to assimilate them to each other's likeness. Mr. Edgeworth was so strongly convinced that from sympathy they involuntarily imitated or caught the tone of the company they frequented, that he held it to be of the most essential importance that they should be taught to select the very best models. quote, "No company or good company," end quote, was his motto. Lord Collingwood, writing to a young friend, said, quote, "Hold it as a maxim that you had better be alone than in mean company. Let your companions be such as yourself or superior, for the worth of a man will always be ruled by that of his company." End quote. It was a remark by the famous Dr. Sydenham that everybody, sometime or other, would be the best or the worst for having but spoken to a good or a bad man. As Sir Peter Lely made it a rule never to look at a bad picture if he could help it, believing that whatever he did so that his pencil caught a taint of it, so whoever chooses to gaze upon a debased specimen of humanity and to frequent their society cannot help gradually assimilating himself to that sort of model. It is therefore advisable for young men to seek the fellowship of the good, and always aim at a higher standard than themselves. Francis Horner, speaking of the advantages to himself of direct personal intercourse with high-minded, intelligent men, said, quote, "I cannot hesitate to decide that I have derived more intellectual improvement from them than from all the books I have turned over." End quote. Lord Shelburne (afterwards Marquis of Lansdowne), when a young man, paid a visit to the Venerable Sherba, and was so much impressed by it that he said, quote, "I have traveled much, but I have never been so influenced by personal contact with any man, and if I ever accomplish any good in the course of my life, I am certain that the recollection of Monsieur de Melcherbert will animate my soul." End quote. So Fowell Buxton was always ready to acknowledge the powerful influence exercised upon the formation of his character in early life by the example of the Gurney family. Quote, "It has given a color to my life," he used to say. Speaking of his success at the Dublin University, he confessed, "I can ascribe it to nothing but my Earlham visits." End quote. It was from the Gurneys he quote, "caught the infection" end quote, of self-improvement. Contact with the good never fails to impart good, and we carry away with us some of the blessings as travelers' garments retain the odor of the flowers and shrubs through which they have passed. Those who knew the late John Sterling intimately have spoken of the beneficial influence which he exercised on all with whom he came into personal contact. Many owed to him their first awakening to a higher being. From him they learnt what they were and what they ought to be. Mr. Trench says of him, quote, "It was impossible to come in contact with his noble nature without feeling oneself in some measure ennobled and lifted up, as I ever felt when I left him, into a higher region of objects and aims than that in which one is tempted habitually to dwell." End quote. It is thus that the noble character always acts. We become insensibly elevated by him, and cannot help feeling as he does, and acquiring the habit of looking at things in the same light. Such is the magical action and reaction of minds upon each other. Artists also feel themselves elevated by contact with artists greater than themselves. Thus Haydn's genius was first fired by Handel. Hearing him play, Haydn's ardor for musical composition was at once excited, and but for this circumstance he himself believed that he would never have written the Creation. Speaking of Handel, he said, quote, "When he chooses, he strikes like the thunderbolt," and at another time, "There is not a note of him but draws blood." End quote. Scarlatti was another of Handel's ardent admirers, following him all over Italy. Afterwards, when speaking of the great master, he would cross himself in token of admiration. True artists never fail generously to recognize each other's greatness. Thus Beethoven's admiration for Cherubini was regal, and he ardently hailed the genius of Schubert. Quote, "Truly," said he, "in Schubert dwells a divine fire." End quote. When Northcote was a mere youth, he had such an admiration for Reynolds that, when the great painter was once attending a public meeting down in Devonshire, the boy pushed through the crowd and got so near Reynolds as to touch the skirt of his coat. Quote, "Which I did," says Northcote, "with a great satisfaction to my mind." End quote. A true touch of youthful enthusiasm in the admiration of genius. End of section 32. Self-Help, with Illustrations of Conduct and Perseverance by Samuel Smiles, Chapter 12, Example, Models, Part 2. One of the most valuable and one of the most infectious examples which can be set for the young is that of cheerful working. Cheerfulness gives elasticity to the spirit. Spectres fly before it, difficulties cause no despair, for they are encountered with hope, and the mind acquires that happy disposition to improve opportunities which rarely fails of success. The fervent spirit is always a healthy and happy spirit, working cheerfully itself and stimulating others to work. It confers a dignity on even the most ordinary occupations. The most effective work also is usually the full-hearted work, that which passes through the hands or the head of him whose heart is glad. Hume was accustomed to say that he would rather possess a cheerful disposition, inclined always to look on the bright side of things, than with a gloomy mind to be the master of an estate of 10,000 a year. Granville Sharp, amidst his indefatigable labors on behalf of the slave, solaced himself in the evenings by taking part in glees and instrumental concerts at his brother's house, singing or playing on the flute, the clarinet, or the oboe. And at the Sunday evening oratorios, when Handel was played, he beat the kettle drums. He also indulged, though sparingly, in caricature drawing. Fowell Buxton, also, was an eminently cheerful man, taking special pleasure in field sports, in riding about the country with his children, and in mixing in all their domestic amusements. In another sphere of action, Dr. Arnold was a noble and a cheerful worker, throwing himself into the great business of his life, the training and teaching of young men, with his whole heart and soul. It is stated in his admirable biography that, quote, "the most remarkable thing in the Laleham circle was the wonderful healthiness of tone which prevailed there. It was a place where a newcomer at once felt that a great and earnest work was going forward. Every pupil was made to feel that there was a work for him to do, that his happiness, as well as his duty, lay in doing that work well. Hence an indescribable zest was communicated to a young man's feeling about life. A strange joy came over him on discerning that he had the means of being useful, and thus being happy, and a deep respect and ardent attachment sprang up towards him who had taught him thus to value life and his own self, and his work and mission in the world. All this was founded on the breadth and comprehensiveness of Arnold's character, as well as its striking truth and reality, on the unfeigned regard he had for work of all kinds, and the sense he had of its value, both for the complex aggregate of society and the growth and protection of the individual. In all this there was no excitement, no predilection for one class of work above another, no enthusiasm for any one-sided object, but a humble, profound, and most religious consciousness that work is the appointed calling of man on earth, the end for which his various faculties were given, the element in which his nature is ordained to develop itself, and in which his progressive advance towards heaven is to lie." End quote. Among the many valuable men trained for public life and usefulness by Arnold was the gallant Hodson of Hodson's Horse, who, riding home from India many years after, thus spoke of his revered master, quote, "The influence he produced has been most lasting and striking in its effects. It is felt even in India, and I cannot say more than that." End quote. The useful influence which a right-hearted man of energy and industry may exercise amongst his neighbors and dependents, and accomplish for his country, cannot perhaps be better illustrated than by the career of Sir John Sinclair, characterized by the Abbé Grégoire as, quote, "the most indefatigable man in Europe." End quote. He was originally a country laird, born to a considerable estate situated near John o' Groat's house, almost beyond the beat of civilization, in a bare wild country fronting the stormy North Sea. His father dying while he was a youth of 16, the management of the family property thus early devolved upon him, and at 18 he began a course of vigorous improvement in the county of Caithness, which eventually spread all over Scotland. Agriculture was then in a most backward state. The fields were unenclosed, the lands undrained. The small farmers of Caithness were so poor that they could scarcely afford to keep a horse or sheltie. The hard work was chiefly done, and the burdens borne, by the women. And if a courtier lost a horse, it was not unusual for him to marry a wife as the cheapest substitute. The country was without roads or bridges, and drovers driving their cattle south had to swim the rivers along with their beasts. The chief track leading to Caithness lay along a high shelf on a mountainside, the road being some 100 feet of clear perpendicular height above the sea which dashed below. Sir John, though a mere youth, determined to make a new road over the hill of Ben Chielt. The old let-alone proprietors, however, regarding his scheme with incredulity and derision. But he himself laid out the road, assembled some 1,200 workmen early one summer's morning, set them simultaneously to work, superintending their labors and stimulating them by his presence and example, and before night what had been a dangerous sheep track, 6 miles in length, hardly passable for led horses, was made practicable for wheeled carriages as if by the power of magic. It was an admirable example of energy and well-directed labor, which could not fail to have a most salutary influence upon the surrounding population. He then proceeded to make more roads, to erect mills, to build bridges, and to enclose and cultivate the waste land. He introduced improved methods of culture and regular rotation of crops, distributing small premiums to encourage industry, and he thus soon quickened the whole frame of society within reach of his influence, and infused an entirely new spirit into the cultivators of the soil. From being one of the most inaccessible districts of the north, the very Ultima Thule of civilization, Caithness became a pattern county for its roads, its agriculture, and its fisheries. In Sinclair's youth, the post was carried by a runner only once a week, and the young baronet then declared that he would never rest till a coach drove daily to Thurso. The people of the neighborhood could not believe in any such thing, and it became a proverb in the country to say of an utterly impossible scheme, aye, that will come to pass when Sir John sees the Daily Mail at Thurso." But Sir John lived to see his dream realized, and the Daily Mail established to Thurso. The circle of his benevolent operation gradually widened. Observing the serious deterioration which had taken place in the quality of British wool, one of the staple commodities of the country, he forthwith, though but a private and little-known country gentleman, devoted himself to its improvement. By his personal exertions he established the British Wool Society for the purpose, and himself led the way to practical improvement by importing 800 sheep from all countries at his own expense. The result was the introduction into Scotland of the celebrated Cheviot breed. Sheep farmers scouted the idea of south country flocks being able to thrive in the far north, but Sir John persevered, and in a few years there were not fewer than 300,000 Cheviot's diffused over the 4 northern counties alone. The value of all grazing land was thus enormously increased, and Scottish estates, which before were comparatively worthless, began to yield large rentals. Returned by Caithness to Parliament, in which he remained for 30 years, rarely missing a division, his position gave him farther opportunities of usefulness, which he did not neglect to employ. Mr. Pitt, observing his persevering energy in all useful public projects, sent for him to Downing Street, and voluntarily proposed his assistance in any object he might have in view. Another man might have thought of himself and his own promotion, but Sir John characteristically replied that he desired no favor for himself, but intimated that the reward most gratifying to his feelings would be Mr. Pitt's assistance in the establishment of a National Board of Agriculture. Arthur Young laid a bet with the baronet that his scheme would never be established, adding, quote, "Your Board of Agriculture will be in the moon," end quote. But vigorously setting to work, he roused public attention to the subject, enlisted a majority of Parliament on his side, and eventually established the board, of which he was appointed president. The result of its action need not be described, but the stimulus which it gave to agriculture and stock raising was shortly felt throughout the whole United Kingdom, and tens of thousands of acres were redeemed from barrenness by its operation. He was equally indefatigable in encouraging the establishment of fisheries, and the successful founding of these great branches of British industry at Thurso and Wick was mainly due to his exertions. He urged for long years, and at length succeeded in obtaining the enclosure of a harbor for the latter place, which is perhaps the greatest and most prosperous fishing town in the world. Sir John threw his personal energy into every work in which he engaged, rousing the inert, stimulating the idle, encouraging the hopeful, and working with all. When a French invasion was threatened, he offered to Mr. Pitt to raise a regiment on his own estate, and he was as good as his word. He went down to the north and raised a battalion of 600 men, afterwards increased to 1,000, and it was admitted to be one of the finest volunteer regiments ever raised, inspired throughout by his own noble and patriotic spirit. While commanding officer at the camp of Aberdeen, he held the offices of a Director of the Bank of Scotland, Chairman of the British Wool Society, Provost of Wick, Director of the British Fisheries Society, Commissioner for issuing Exchequer bills, Member of Parliament for Caithness, and President of the Board of Agriculture. Amidst all his nefarious and self-imposed work, he even found time to write books, enough of themselves to establish a reputation. When Mr. Rush, the American ambassador, arrived in England, he relates that he inquired of Mr. Coke of Holkham what was the best work on agriculture, and was referred to Sir John Sinclair's. And when he further asked Mr. Vansittart, Chancellor of the Exchequer, what was the best work on British finance, he was again referred to a work by Sir John Sinclair, his History of the Public Revenue. But the great monument of his indefatigable industry, a work that would have appalled other men, but only served to rouse and sustain his energy, was his Statistical Account of Scotland, in 21 volumes, one of the most valuable practical works ever published in any age or country. Amid a host of other pursuits that occupied him nearly 8 years of hard labor, during which he received and attended to upwards of 20,000 letters on the subject. It was a thoroughly patriotic undertaking, from which he derived no personal advantage whatever beyond the honor of having completed it. The whole of the profits were assigned by him to the Society for the Sons of the Clergy in Scotland. The publication of the book led to great public improvements. It was followed by the immediate abolition of several oppressive feudal rights, to which it called attention. The salaries of schoolmasters and clergymen in many parishes were increased, and an increased stimulus was given to agriculture throughout Scotland. Sir John then publicly offered to undertake the much greater labor of collecting and publishing a similar statistical account of England, but unhappily the then Archbishop of Canterbury refused to sanction it, lest it should interfere with the tithes of the clergy, and the idea was abandoned. A remarkable illustration of his energetic promptitude was the manner in which he once provided, on a great emergency, for the relief of the manufacturing districts. In 1793, the stagnation produced by the war led to an unusual number of bankruptcies, and many of the first houses in Manchester and Glasgow were tottering, not so much from the want of property, but because the usual sources of trade and credit were for the time closed up. A period of intense distress amongst the laboring classes seemed imminent, and when Sir John urged in Parliament that Exchequer notes to the amount of 5 millions should be issued immediately as a loan to such merchants as could give security, this suggestion was adopted, and his offer to carry out his plan in conjunction with certain members named by him was also accepted. The vote was passed late at night, and early next morning Sir John, anticipating the delays of officialism and red tape, proceeded to bankers in the city and borrowed of them on his own personal security the sum of £70,000, which he dispatched the same evening to those merchants who were in the most urgent need of assistance. Pitt, meeting Sir John in the House, expressed his great regret that the pressing wants of Manchester and Glasgow could not be supplied so soon as was desirable, adding, "The money cannot be raised for some days." "It is already gone. It left London by tonight's mail," was Sir John's triumphant reply. And in afterwards relating the anecdote, he added, with a smile of pleasure, "Pitt was as much startled as if I had stabbed him." To the last this great good man worked on usefully and cheerfully, setting a great example for his family and for his country. And so laboriously seeking others' good, it might be said that he found his own, not wealth, for his generosity seriously impaired his private fortune, but happiness and self-satisfaction and the peace that passes knowledge. A great patriot with magnificent powers of work, he nobly did his duty to his country, yet he was not neglectful to his old household and home. His sons and daughters grew up to honor and usefulness, and it was one of the proudest things Sir John could say, when verging on his 80th year, that he had lived to see 7 sons grown up, not one of whom had incurred a debt he could not pay, or caused him a sorrow that could have been avoided. End of Chapter 12, Part 2. Self-Help, with Illustrations of Conduct and Perseverance, by Samuel Smiles. Section 34, Character, the True Gentleman, Part 1. For who can always act, but he to whom 1,000 memories call, not being less, but more than all the gentleness he seemed to be, but seemed the thing he was, and joined each office of the social hour to noble manners, as the flower and native growth of noble mind, and thus he bore without abuse the grand old name of gentleman. Tennyson. Es bildet ein Talent sich in der Stille, sich ein Charakter in dem Strom der Welt. Goethe. That which raises a country, that which strengthens a country, and that which dignifies a country, that which spreads her power, creates her moral influence, and makes her respected and submitted to, bends the hearts of millions, and bows down the pride of nations to her, the instrument of obedience, the fountain of supremacy, the true throne, crown, and scepter of a nation. This aristocracy is not an aristocracy of blood, not an aristocracy of fashion, not an aristocracy of talent only. It is an aristocracy of character. That is the true heraldry of man. The Times. The crown and glory of life is character. It is the noblest possession of a man, constituting a rank in itself, and an estate in the general goodwill, dignifying every station and exalting every position in society. It exercises a greater power than wealth, and secures all the honor without the jealousies of fame. It carries with it an influence which always tells, for it is the result of proved honor, rectitude, and consistency, qualities which, perhaps more than any other, command a general confidence and respect of mankind. Character is human nature in its best form. It is moral order embodied in the individual. Men of character are not only the conscience of society, but in every well-governed state they are its best motive power. For it is moral qualities in the main which rule the world. Even in war, Napoleon said, "The moral is to the physical as 10 to 1." The strength, the industry, and the civilization of nations all depend upon individual character, and the very foundations of civil security rest upon it. Laws and institutions are but its outgrowth. In the just balance of nature, individuals, nations, and races will obtain just so much as they deserve, and no more. And as effect finds its cause, so surely does quality of character amongst a people produce its benefiting results. Though a man have comparatively little culture, slender abilities, and but small wealth, yet if his character be of sterling worth, he will always command an influence, whether it be in the workshop, the counting-house, the mart, or the senate. Canning wisely wrote in 1801, quote, "My road must be through character to power. I will try no other course, and I am sanguine enough to believe that this course, though not perhaps the quickest, is the surest." End quote. You may admire men of intellect, but something more is necessary before you will trust them. Hence Lord John Russell once observed in a sentence full of truth, quote, "It is the nature of party in England to ask the assistance of a man of genius, but to follow the guidance of men of character." End quote. This was strikingly illustrated in the career of the late Francis Horner, a man of whom Sidney Smith said that the 10 Commandments were stamped upon his countenance. Quote, "The valuable and peculiar light," says Lord Cockburn, "in which his history is calculated to inspire every right-minded youth is this: he died at the age of 38, possessed of greater public influence than any other private man, and admired, beloved, trusted, and deplored by all except the heartless or the base. No greater homage was ever paid in Parliament to any deceased member. Now let every young man ask, how was this attained? By rank? He was the son of an Edinburgh merchant. By wealth? Neither he nor any of his relations ever had a superfluous sixpence. By office? He held but one, and only for a few years, of no influence and with very little pay. By talents? His were not splendid, and he had no genius. Cautious and slow, his only ambition was to be right. By eloquence? He spoke in calm good taste, without any of the oratory that either terrifies or seduces. By any fascination of manner? His was only correct and agreeable. By what then was it? Merely by sense, industry, good principles, and a good heart, qualities which no well-constituted mind need ever despair of attaining. It was the force of his character that raised him, and this character not impressed upon him by nature, but formed out of no peculiarly fine elements by himself. There were many in the House of Commons of far greater ability and eloquence, but no one surpassed him in the combination of an adequate portion of these with moral worth. Horner was born to show what moderate powers, unaided by anything whatever except culture and goodness, may achieve, even when these powers are displayed amidst the competition and jealousy of public life." End quote. Franklin also attributed his success as a public man not to his talents or his powers of speaking, for these were but moderate, but to his known integrity of character. Hence it was, he says, quote, "that I had so much weight with my fellow citizens. I was but a bad speaker, never eloquent, subject to much hesitation in my choice of words, hardly correct in language, and yet I generally carried my point." End quote. Character creates confidence in men in high station as well as in humble life. It was said of the first Emperor Alexander of Russia that his personal character was equivalent to a constitution. During the wars of the Fronde, Montaigne was the only man amongst the French gentry who kept his castle gates unbarred, and it was said of him that his personal character was a better protection for him than a regiment of horse would have been. That character is power is true in a much higher sense than that knowledge is power. Mind without heart, intelligence without conduct, cleverness without goodness are powers in their way, but they may be powers only for mischief. We may be instructed or amused by them, but it is sometimes as difficult to admire them as it would be to admire the dexterity of a pickpocket or the horsemanship of a highwayman. Truthfulness, integrity, and goodness, qualities that hang not on any man's breath, form the essence of manly character, or as one of our old writers has it, quote, that inbred loyalty unto virtue which can serve her without a livery. End quote. He who possesses these qualities, united with strength of purpose, carries with him a power which is irresistible. He is strong to do good, strong to resist evil, and strong to bear up under difficulty and misfortune. When Stephen of Colonna fell into the hands of his base assailants, they asked him in derision, "Where is now your fortress?" "Here," was his bold reply, placing his hand upon his heart. "It is in misfortune that the character of the upright man shines forth with the greatest luster, and when all else fails, he takes stand upon his integrity and his courage." The rules of conduct followed by Lord Erskine, a man of sterling independence of principle and scrupulous adherence to truth, are worthy to be engraven on every young man's heart. Quote, "It was a first command and counsel of my early youth," said he, "always to do what my conscience told me to be a duty, and to leave the consequence to God. I shall carry with me the memory, and I trust the practice, of this parental lesson to the grave. I have hitherto followed it, and have no reason to complain that my obedience to it has been a temporal sacrifice. I have found it, on the contrary, the road to prosperity and wealth, and I shall point out the same path to my children for their pursuit." End quote. Every man is bound to aim at the possession of good character as one of the highest objects of life. The very effort to secure it by worthy means will furnish him with a motive for exertion, and his idea of manhood, in proportion as it is elevated, will steady and animate his motive. It is well to have a high standard of life, even though we may not be able altogether to realize it. Quote, "The youth," says Mr. Disraeli, "who does not look up will look down, and the spirit that does not soar is destined, perhaps, to grovel." End quote. George Herbert wisely writes, "Pitch thy behavior low, thy projects high, so shall thou humble and magnanimous be. Sink not in spirit. Who aimeth at the sky shoots higher much than he that means a tree." End quote. He who has a high standard of living and thinking will certainly do better than he who has none at all. Quote, "Pluck at a gown of gold," says the Scotch proverb, "and you may get a sleeve of it." End quote. Whoever tries for the highest results cannot fail to reach a point far in advance of that from which he started, and though the end attained may fall short of that proposed, still the very effort to rise of itself cannot fail to prove permanently beneficial. There are many counterfeits of character, but the genuine article is difficult to be mistaken. Some, knowing its money value, would assume its disguise for the purpose of imposing upon the unwary. Colonel Charteris said to a man distinguished for his honesty, quote, "I would give 1,000 pounds for your good name." "Why?" "Because I could make 10,000 by it," end quote, was the knave's reply. Integrity in word and deed is the backbone of character, and loyal adherence to veracity is its most prominent characteristic. One of the finest testimonies to the character of the late Sir Robert Peel was that borne by the Duke of Wellington in the House of Lords a few days after that great statesman's death. Quote, "Your lordships," he said, "must all feel the high and honorable character of the late Sir Robert Peel. I was long connected with him in public life. We were both in the councils of our sovereign together, and I had long the honor to enjoy his private friendship. In all the course of my acquaintance with him, I never knew a man in whose truth and justice I had greater confidence, or in whom I saw a more invariable desire to promote the public service. In the whole course of my communication with him, I never knew an instance in which he did not show the strongest attachment to truth, and I never saw in the whole course of my life the smallest reason for suspecting that he stated anything which he did not firmly believe to be the fact." End quote. And this high-minded truthfulness of the statesman was no doubt the secret of no small part of his influence and power. There is a truthfulness in action as well as in words which is essential to uprightness of character. A man must really be what he seems or proposes to be. When an American gentleman wrote to Granville Sharp that from respect for his great virtues he had named one of his sons after him, Sharp replied, quote, "I must request you to teach him a favorite maxim of the family whose name you have given him. Always endeavor to be really what you wish to appear." This maxim, as my father informed me, was carefully and humbly practiced by his father, whose sincerity as a plain and honest man thereby became the principal feature of his character, both in public and private life. End quote. Every man who respects himself and values the respect of others will carry out the maxim in act, doing honestly what he proposes to do, putting the highest character into his work, scamping nothing, but priding himself upon his integrity and his conscientiousness. Once Cromwell said to Bernard, a clever but somewhat unscrupulous lawyer, quote, "I understand that you have lately been vastly wary in your conduct. Do not be too confident of this. Subtlety may deceive you. Integrity never will." End quote. Men whose acts are at direct variance with their words command no respect, and what they say has but little weight. Even truths, when uttered by them, seem to come blasted from their lips. The true character acts rightly, whether in secret or in the sight of men. That boy was well trained who, when asked why he did not pocket some pears, for nobody was there to see, replied, quote, "Yes, there was. I was there to see myself, and I don't intend ever to see myself do a dishonest thing." End quote. This is a simple but not inappropriate illustration of principle or conscience dominating in the character and exercising a noble protectorate over it. Not merely a passive influence, but an active power regulating the life. Such a principle goes on molding the character hourly and daily, growing with a force that operates every moment. Without this dominating influence, character has no protection, but is constantly liable to fall away before temptation, and every such temptation succumbed to, every act of meanness or dishonesty, however slight, causes self-degradation. It matters not whether the act be successful or not, discovered or concealed. The culprit is no longer the same, but another person, and he is pursued by a secret uneasiness, by self-reproach, or the workings of what we call conscience, which is the inevitable doom of the guilty. And here it may be observed how greatly the character may be strengthened and supported by the cultivation of good habits. Man, it has been said, is a bundle of habits, and habit is second nature. Metastasio entertained so strong an opinion as to the power of repetition in act and thought that he said, quote, "All is habit in mankind, even virtue itself." End quote. Butler, in his Analogy, impresses the importance of careful self-discipline and firm resistance to temptation as tending to make virtue habitual, so that at length it may become more easy to be good than to give way to sin. Quote, "As habits belonging to the body," he says, "are produced by external acts, so habits of the mind are produced by the execution of inward practical purposes, that is, carrying them into act or acting upon them the principles of obedience, veracity, justice, and charity." End quote. And again Lord Brougham says, when enforcing the immense importance of training and example in youth, quote, "I trust everything under God to habit, on which, in all ages, the lawgiver, as well as the schoolmaster, has mainly placed his reliance. Habit, which makes everything easy, and casts the difficulties upon the deviation from a wonted course." End quote. Thus, make sobriety a habit, and intemperance will be hateful. Make prudence a habit, and reckless profligacy will become revolting to every principle of conduct which regulates the life of the individual. Hence the necessity for the greatest care and watchfulness against the inroad of any evil habit. for the character is always weakest at that point at which it has once given way, and it is long before a principle restored can become so firm as one that has never been moved. It is a fine remark of a Russian writer that, quote, "habits are a necklace of pearls. Untie the knot, and the whole unthreads." End quote. Wherever formed, habit acts involuntarily and without effort, and it is only when you oppose it that you find how powerful it has become. What is done once and again soon gives facility and proneness. The habit at first may seem to have no more strength than a spider's web, but, once formed, it binds as with a chain of iron. The small events of life, taken singly, may seem exceedingly unimportant, like snow that falls silently, flake by flake, and yet accumulated, these snowflakes form the avalanche. Self-respect, self-help, application, industry, integrity, all are of the nature of habits, not beliefs. Principles, in fact, are but the names which we assign to habits, for the principles are words, but the habits are the things themselves, benefactors or tyrants, according as they are good or evil. It thus happens that as we grow older, a portion of our free activity and individuality becomes suspended in habit. Our actions become of the nature of fate, and we are bound by the chains which we have woven around ourselves. It is indeed scarcely possible to overestimate the importance of training the young to virtuous habits. In them they are the easiest formed, and when formed they last for life. Like letters cut on the bark of a tree, they grow and widen with age. Quote, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." End quote. The beginning holds within it the end. The first start on the road of life determines the direction and the destination of the journey. Ce n'est que la première pas qui coûte. "Remember," said Lord Collingworth to a young man whom he loved, "before you are 25, you must establish a character that will serve you all your life." End quote. As habit strengthens with age, and character becomes formed, any turning into a new path becomes more and more difficult. Hence it is often harder to unlearn than to learn, and for this reason the Grecian flute player was justified who charged double fees to those pupils who had been taught by an inferior master. To uproot an old habit is sometimes a more painful thing, and vastly more difficult, than to wrench out a tooth. Try and reform a habitually indolent or improvident or drunken person, and in a majority of cases you will fail. For the habit in each case has wound itself in and through the life until it has become an integral part of it, and cannot be uprooted. Hence, as Mr. Lynch observes, quote, "The wisest habit of all is the habit of care in the formation of good habits." End quote. Even happiness itself may become habitual. There is a habit of looking on the bright side of things and also of looking at the dark side. Dr. Johnson has said that the habit of looking at the best side of a thing is worth more to a man than £1,000 a year. And we possess the power, to a great extent, of so exercising the will as to direct the thoughts upon objects calculated to yield happiness and improvement rather than their opposites. In this way the habit of happy thought may be made to spring up like any other habit. And to bring up men or women with a genial nature of this sort, a good temper, and a happy frame of mind, is perhaps of even more importance in many cases than to perfect them in much knowledge and many accomplishments. As daylight can be seen through very small holes, so little things will illustrate a person's character. Indeed, character consists in little acts, well and honorably performed. Daily life being the quarry from which we build it up, and rough hew the habits which form it. One of the most marked tests of character is the manner in which we conduct ourselves towards others. A graceful behavior towards superiors, inferiors, and equals is a constant source of pleasure. It pleases others because it indicates respect for their personality, but it gives tenfold more pleasure to ourselves. Every man may, to a large extent, be a self-educator in good behavior as in everything else. He can be civil and kind, if he will, though he have not a penny in his purse. Gentleness in society is like the silent influence of light, which gives color to all nature. It is far more powerful than loudness or force, and far more fruitful. It pushes its way quietly and persistently, like the tiniest daffodil in spring, which raises the clod and thrusts it aside by the simple persistency of growing. Even a kind look will give pleasure and confer happiness. In one of Robertson of Brighton's letters, he tells of a lady who related to him, quote, the delight and the tears of gratitude which she had witnessed in a poor girl to whom, in passing, I gave a kind look on going out of church on Sunday. What a lesson! How cheaply happiness can be given! What opportunities we miss of doing an angel's work! I remember doing it, full of sad feelings, passing on and thinking no more about it, and it gave an hour's sunshine to a human's life, and lightened the load of life to a human heart for a time." End quote. Morals and manners, which give color to life, are of much greater importance than laws, which are but their manifestations. The law touches us here and there, but manners are about us everywhere, pervading society like the air we breathe. Good manners, as we call them, are neither more nor less than good behavior, consisting of courtesy and kindness, benevolence being the preponderating element in all kinds of mutually beneficial and pleasant intercourse among human beings. Quote, "Civility," said Lady Montague, "costs nothing and buys everything." End quote. The cheapest of all things is kindness, its exercise requiring the least possible trouble and sacrifice. Quote, "Win hearts," said Burleigh to Queen Elizabeth, "and you will have all men's hearts and purses." End quote. If we would only let nature act kindly, free from affectation and artifice, the results on social good humor and happiness would be incalculable. The little courtesies which form the small change of life may separately appear of little intrinsic value, but they acquire their importance from repetition and accumulation. They are like the spare minutes or the groat a day, which proverbially produce such momentous results in the course of a 12-month, or in a lifetime. Manners are the ornament of action, and there is a way of speaking a kind word or of doing a kind thing which greatly enhances their value. What seems to be done with a grudge or as an act of condescension is scarcely accepted as a favor. Yet there are men who pride themselves upon their gruffness, and though they may possess virtue and capacity, their manner is often such as to render them almost insupportable. It is difficult to like a man who, though he may not pull your nose, habitually wounds your self-respect and takes a pride in saying disagreeable things to you. There are others who are dreadfully condescending and cannot avoid seizing upon every small opportunity of making their greatness felt. When Abernethy was canvassing for the office of surgeon to St. Bartholomew Hospital, he called upon such a person, a rich grocer, one of the governors. The great man behind the counter, seeing the great surgeon enter, immediately assumed the grand airs toward the supposed suppliant for his vote. "I presume, sir, you want my vote and interest at this momentous epoch in your life?" End quote. Abernethy, who hated humbugs and felt nettled at the tone, replied, "No, I don't. I want a pennyworth of figs. Come, look sharp, and wrap them up. I want to be off." End quote. The cultivation of manner, though in excess it is foppish and foolish, is highly necessary in a person who has occasion to negotiate with others in matters of business. Affability and good breeding may even be regarded as essential to the success of a man in any eminent station and in large sphere of life, for the want of it has not infrequently been found in a great measure to neutralize the results of much industry, integrity, and honesty of character. There are, no doubt, a few strong tolerant minds which can bear with defects and angularities of manner, and look only to the more genuine qualities. But the world at large is not so forbearant, and cannot help forming its judgments and likings mainly according to outward conduct. Another mode of displaying true politeness is consideration for the opinions of others. It has been said of dogmatism that it is only puppyism come to its full growth, and certainly the worst form this quality can assume is that of opinionativeness and arrogance. Let men agree to differ, and when they do differ, bear and forbear. Principles and opinions may be maintained with perfect suavity, without coming to blows or uttering harsh words, and there are circumstances in which words are blows, and inflict wounds far less easy to heal. As bearing upon this point, we quote an instructive little parable spoken some time since by an itinerant preacher of the Evangelical Alliance on the borders of Wales. Quote, "As I was going to see the hills," said he, "early one misty morning, I saw something moving on the mountainside, so strange looking that I took it for a monster. When I came near to it, I found it was a man. When I came up to him, I found it was my brother." End quote. The inbred politeness which springs from right-heartedness and kindly feelings is of no exclusive rank or station. The mechanic who works at the bench may possess it, as well as the clergyman or the peer. It is by no means a necessary condition of labor that it should, in any respect, be either rough or coarse. The politeness and refinement which distinguish all classes of the people in many continental countries show that those qualities might become ours too, as doubtless they will become with increased culture and more general social intercourse, without sacrificing any of our more genuine qualities as men. From the highest to the lowest, the richest to the poorest, to no rank or condition in life has nature denied her highest boon, the great heart. There never existed a gentleman but was a lord of a great heart, and this may exhibit itself under the hodden gray of the peasant as well as under the laced coat of the noble. Robert Burns was once taken to task by a young Edinburgh blood with whom he was walking for recognizing an honest farmer in the open street. Quote, "Why, you fantastic gomeril," exclaimed Burns, "it was not the great coat, the Scone bonnet, and the Saunders boot hose that I spoke to, but the man that was in them. And the man, sir, for true worth, would weigh down you and me, and 10 more such, any day." End quote. There may be a homeliness in externals which may seem vulgar to those who cannot discern the heart beneath, but to the right-minded, character will always have its clear insignia. End of section 34. Self-Help, with Illustrations of Conduct and Perseverance by Samuel Smiles. Chapter 13. Character, the True Gentleman, Part 2. William and Charles Grant were sons of a farmer in Inverness-shire, who a sudden flood stripped of everything, even to the very soil which he tilled. The farmer and his sons, with the world before them where to choose, made their way southward in search of employment until they arrived in the neighborhood of Bury in Lancashire. From the crown of the hill near Walmesley they surveyed the wide extent of country which lay before them, the river Irwell making its circuitous course through the valley. They were utter strangers in the neighborhood and knew not which way to turn. To decide their course they put up a stick and agreed to pursue the direction in which it fell. Thus their decision was made, and they journeyed on accordingly until they reached the village of Ramsbottom, not far distant. They found employment in a print work, in which William served his apprenticeship, and they commended themselves to their employers by their diligence, sobriety, and strict integrity. They plodded on, rising from one station to another, until at length the two men themselves became employers, and after many long years of industry, enterprise, and benevolence, they became rich, honored, and respected by all who knew them. Their cotton mills and print works gave employment to a large population. Their well-directed diligence made the valley teem with activity, joy, health, and opulence. Out of their abundant wealth they gave liberally to all worthy objects, erecting churches, funding schools, and in all ways promoting the well-being of the class of working men from which they had sprung. They afterwards erected, on the top of the hill above Walmsley, a lofty tower in commemoration of the early event in their history which had determined the place of their settlement. The brothers Grant became widely celebrated for their benevolence and their various goodness, and it is said that Mr. Dickens had them in his mind's eye when delineating the character of the brothers Cheerbley. One of many anecdotes of a similar kind may be cited to show that the character was by no means exaggerated. A Manchester warehouseman published an exceedingly scurrilous pamphlet against the firm of Grant Brothers, holding up the elder partner to ridicule as Billy Button. William was informed by someone of the nature of the pamphlet, and his observation was that the man would live to repent of it. "Oh," said the libeller, when informed of the remark, "he thinks that some time or other I shall be in his debt, but I will take good care of that." It happens, however, that men in business do not always foresee who shall be their creditor, and it so turned out that the Grant's libeller became a bankrupt, and could not complete his certificate and begin business again without obtaining their signature. It seemed to him a hopeless case to call upon that firm for any favor, but the pressing claims of his family forced him to make the application. He appeared before the man whom he had ridiculed as Billy Button accordingly. He told his tale and produced his certificate. "You wrote a pamphlet against us once," said Mr. Grant. The supplicant expected to see his document thrown into the fire, instead of which Mr. Grant signed the name of the firm, and thus completed the necessary certificate. "We make it a rule," he said, handing it back, "never to refuse signing the certificate of an honest tradesman, and we have never heard that you were anything else." The tears started into the man's eye. "Ah," continued Mr. Grant, "you see my saying was true that you would live to repent writing that pamphlet. I did not mean it as a threat. I only meant that some day you would know us better, and repent having tried to injure us." I do indeed repent it." "Well, well, you know us now. But how do you get on? What are you going to do?" The poor man stated that he had friends who would assist him when his certificate was obtained. "But how are you off in the meantime?" The answer was that, having given up every farthing to his creditors, he had been compelled to stint his family in even the common necessaries of life, that he might be enabled to pay for his certificate. "My good fellow, this will never do. Your wife and family must not suffer in this way. Be kind enough to take this £10 note to your wife from me. There now, don't cry. It will be all well with you yet. Keep up your spirits, set to work like a man, and you will raise your head among the best of us yet." The overpowered man endeavored with choking utterance to express his gratitude, but in vain, and putting his hand to his face, he went out of the room, sobbing like a child. The true gentleman is one whose nature has been fashioned after the highest models. It is a grand old name, that of gentleman, and has been recognized as a rank and power in all stages of society. "The gentleman is always a gentleman," said the old French general of his regiment of Scottish gentry at Roussillon, "and invariably proves itself such in need and in danger." To possess this character is a dignity of itself, commanding the instinctive homage of every generous mind, and those who will not bow to titular rank, yet will do homage to the gentleman. His qualities depend not upon fashion or manners, but upon moral worth, not on personal possessions, but on personal qualities. The psalmist briefly describes him as one "that walketh uprightly, and worketh righteousness, and speaketh the truth in his heart." The gentleman is eminently distinguished for his self-respect. He values his character, not so much of it only as can be seen of others, but as he sees it himself. having regard for the approval of his inward monitor, and as he respects himself, so, by the same law, does he respect others. Humanity is sacred in his eyes, and thence proceeds politeness and forbearance, kindness and charity. It is related of Lord Edward Fitzgerald that, while traveling in Canada in company with the Indians, he was shocked by the sight of a poor squaw trudging along laden with her husband's trappings, while the chief himself walked on unencumbered. Lord Edward at once relieved the squaw of her pack by placing it upon his own shoulders, a beautiful instance of what the French call politesse de coeur, the inbred politeness of the true gentleman. The true gentleman has a keen sense of honor, scrupulously avoiding mean actions. His standard of probity in word and action is high. He does not shuffle or prevaricate, dodge or skulk, but is honest, upright, and straightforward. His law is rectitude, action in right lines. When he says yes, it is a law, and he dares to say the valiant no at the fitting season. The gentleman will not be bribed. Only the low-minded and unprincipled will sell themselves to those who are interested in buying them. When the upright Jonas Hanway officiated as Commissioner, Victualling Department, he declined to receive a present of any kind from a contractor, refusing thus to be biased in the performance of his public duty. A fine trait of the same kind is to be noted in the life of the Duke of Wellington. Shortly after the Battle of Assaye, one morning the Prime Minister of the Court of Hyderabad waited upon him for the purpose of privately ascertaining what territory and what advantages had been reserved for his master in the treaty of peace between the Maratha princes and the Nizam. To obtain this information, the minister offered the general a very large sum, considerably above £100,000. Looking at him quietly for a few seconds, Sir Arthur said, "It appears, then, that you are capable of keeping a secret?" "Yes, certainly," replied the minister. "Then so am I," said the English general, smiling, and bowed the minister out. It was to Wellington's great honor that, though uniformly successful in India, and with the power of earning in such modes as this enormous wealth, he did not add a farthing to his fortune, and returned to England a comparatively poor man. A similar sensitiveness and high-mindedness characterized his noble relative, the Marquis of Wellesley, who, on one occasion, positively refused a present of £100,000 proposed to be given him by the directors of the East India Company on the conquest of Mysore. "It is not necessary," said he, "for me to allude to the independence of my character and the proper dignity attaching to my office. Other reasons, besides these important considerations, lead me to decline this testimony, which is not suitable to me. I think of nothing but our army. I should be much distressed to curtail the share of those brave soldiers." And the Marquis's resolution to refuse the present remained unalterable. Sir Charles Napier exhibited the same noble self-denial in the course of his Indian career. He rejected all the costly gifts which barbaric princes were ready to lay at his feet, and said with truth, "Certainly I could have got £30,000 since my coming to Sind, but my hands do not want washing yet. Our dear father's sword, which I wore in both battles, Meni and Hyderabad, is unstained." Riches and rank have no necessary connection with genuine gentlemanly qualities. The poor man may be a true gentleman, in spirit and in daily life. He may be honest, truthful, upright, polite, temperate, courageous, self-respecting, and self-helping. That is, be a true gentleman. The poor man with a rich spirit is in all ways superior to the rich man with a poor spirit. To borrow St. Paul's words, the former is as having nothing, yet possessing all things, while the other, though possessing all things, has nothing. The first hopes everything and fears nothing. The last hopes nothing and fears everything. Only the poor in spirit are really poor. He who has lost all, but retains his courage, cheerfulness, hope, virtue, and self-respect, is still rich. For such a man, the world is, as it were, held in trust. His spirit dominating over its grosser cares, he can still walk erect, a true gentleman. Occasionally the brave and gentle character may be found under the humblest garb. Here is an old illustration, but a fine one. Once on a time, when the Adige suddenly overflowed its banks, the bridge of Verona was carried away, with the exception of the center arch, on which stood a house whose inhabitants supplicated help from the windows while the foundations were visibly giving way. "I will give 100 French louis," said the Count Spolverini, who stood by, "to any person who will venture to deliver these unfortunate people." A young peasant came forth from the crowd, seized a boat, and pushed into the stream. He gained the pier, received the whole family into the boat, and made for the shore, where he landed them in safety. "Here is your money, my brave young fellow," said the Count. "No," was the answer of the young man, "I do not sell my life. Give the money to this poor family who have need of it." Here spoke the true spirit of the gentleman, though he was but in the garb of a peasant. Not less touching was the heroic conduct of a party of Deal boatmen in rescuing the crew of a collier brig in the Downs but a short time ago. A sudden storm, which set in from the northeast, drove several ships from their anchors, and it being low water, one of them struck the ground at a considerable distance from the shore, when the sea made a clean breach over her. There was not a vestige of hope for the vessel, such was the fury of the wind and the violence of the waves. There was nothing to tempt the boatmen on shore to risk their lives in saving either ship or crew, for not a farthing of salvage was to be looked for. But the daring intrepidity of the Deal boatmen was not wanting at this critical moment. No sooner had the brig grounded than Simon Pritchard, one of the many persons assembled along the beach, threw off his coat and called out, "Who will come with me and try to save that crew?" Instantly 20 men sprang forward with, "I will," and "I." But only 7 were wanted, and running down a galley punt to the surf, they leapt in and dashed through the breakers amidst the cheers of those on shore. How the boat lived in such a sea seemed a miracle. But in a few minutes, impelled by the strong arms of these gallant men, she flew on and reached the stranded ship, catching her on the top of a wave. And in less than a quarter of an hour from the time the boat left the shore, the 6 men who composed the crew of the collier were landed safe on Walmer Beach. A nobler instance of indomitable courage and disinterested heroism on the part of the Deal boatmen, brave though they are always known to be, perhaps cannot be cited, and we have pleasure in here placing it on record. Mr. Turnbull, in his work on Austria, relates an anecdote of the late Emperor Francis, an illustration of the manner in which the government of that country has been indebted for its hold upon the people to the personal qualities of its princes. "At the time when the cholera was raging in Vienna, the emperor, with an aide-de-camp, was strolling about the streets of the city and suburbs, when a corpse was dragged past on a litter unaccompanied by a single mourner. The unusual circumstance attracted his attention, and he learnt on inquiry that the deceased was a poor person who had died of cholera, and that the relatives had not ventured on what was then considered the very dangerous office of attending the body to the grave. 'Then,' said Francis, 'we will supply their place, for none of my poor people should go to the grave without the last mark of respect.' And he followed the body to the distant place of interment, and, bareheaded, stood to see every rite and observance respectfully performed." Fine though this illustration may be of the qualities of the gentleman, we can match it by another equally good, of 2 English navvies in Paris, as related in a morning paper a few years ago. "One day a hearse was observed ascending the steep Rue de Clichy on its way to Montmartre, bearing a coffin of poplar wood with its cold corpse. Not a soul followed, not even the living dog of the dead man, if he had one. The day was rainy and dismal. Passers-by lifted the hat, as is usual when a funeral passes, and that was all. At length it passed 2 English navvies, who found themselves in Paris on their way from Spain. A right feeling spoke from beneath their serge jackets. "Poor wretch," said one to the other, "no one follows him. Let us too follow." And the two took off their hats and walked bareheaded after the corpse of a stranger to the cemetery of Montmartre. Above all, the gentleman is truthful. He feels that truth is the summit of being, and the soul of rectitude in human affairs. Lord Chesterfield declared that truth made the success of a gentleman. The Duke of Wellington, writing to Kellerman on the subject of prisoners on parole, when opposed to that general in the Peninsula, told him that if there was one thing on which an English officer prided himself more than another, excepting his courage, it was truthfulness. "When English officers," said he, "have given their parole of honor not to escape, be sure that they will not break it. Believe me, trust to their word. The word of an English officer is a surer guarantee than the vigilance of sentinels." True courage and gentleness go hand in hand. The brave man is generous and forbearant, never unforgiving and cruel. It was finely said of Sir John Franklin by his friend Perry that, "he was a man who never turned his back upon danger, yet of that tenderness that he would not brush away a mosquito." A fine trait of character, truly gentle and worthy of the spirit of Bayard, was displayed by a French officer in the cavalry combat of El Bedon in Spain. He had raised his sword to strike Sir Felton Harvey, but perceiving his antagonist had only one arm, he instantly stopped, brought down his sword before Sir Felton in the usual salute, and rode past. To this may be added a noble and gentle deed of Ney during the same Peninsular War. Charles Napier was taken prisoner at Corunna, desperately wounded, and his friends at home did not know whether he was alive or dead. A special messenger was sent out from England with a frigate to ascertain his fate. Baron Collier received the flag and informed Ney of the arrival. "Let the prisoner see his friends," said Ney, "and tell them that he is well and well treated." Collier lingered, and Ney asked, smiling, what more he wanted. "He has an old mother, a widow and blind." "Has he? Then let him go himself and tell her he is alive." As the exchange of prisoners between the countries was not then allowed, Ney knew that he risked the displeasure of the Emperor by setting the young officer at liberty, but Napoleon approved the generous act. Notwithstanding the wail which we occasionally hear for the chivalry that is gone, our own age has witnessed deeds of bravery and gentleness, of heroic self-denial and manly tenderness, which are unsurpassed in history. The events of the last few years have shown that our countrymen are as yet an undegenerate race. On the bleak plateau of Sebastopol, in the dripping, perilous trenches of that 12 months' leaguer, men of all classes proved themselves worthy of the noble inheritance of character which their forefathers had bequeathed to them. But it was in the hour of the great trial in India that the qualities of our countrymen shone forth the brightest. The march of Neil on Cawnpore, of Havelock on Lucknow, officers and men alike urged on by the hope of rescuing the women and children, are events which the whole history of chivalry cannot equal. Outram's conduct to Havelock, in resigning to him, though his inferior officer, the honor of leading the attack on Lucknow, was a trait worthy of Sidney, and alone justifies the title which has been awarded to him of the Bayard of India. The death of Henry Lawrence, that brave and gentle spirit, his last words before dying, "Let there be no fuss about me, let me be buried with the men." The anxious solicitude of Sir Colin Campbell to rescue the beleaguered of Lucknow, and to conduct his long train of women and children by night from thence to Cawnpore, which he reached amidst the all but overpowering assault of the enemy. The care with which he led them across the perilous bridge, never ceasing his charge over them until he had seen the precious convoy safe on the road to Allahabad, and then burst upon the Gwalior contingent like a thunderclap. Such things make us feel proud of our countrymen, and inspire the conviction that the best and purest glow of chivalry is not dead, but vigorously lives among us yet. Even the common soldiers proved themselves gentlemen under their trials. At Agra, where so many poor fellows had been scorched and wounded in their encounter with the enemy, they were brought into the fort and tenderly nursed by the ladies, and the rough, gallant fellows proved gentle as any children. During the weeks that the ladies watched over their charge, never a word was said by any soldier that could shock the ear of the gentlest. And when all was over, when the mortally wounded had died, and the sick and maimed who survived were able to demonstrate their gratitude, they invited their nurses and the chief people of Agra to an entertainment in the beautiful gardens of the Taj, where, amidst flowers and music, the rough veterans, all scarred and mutilated as they were, stood up to thank their gentle countrywomen who had clothed and fed them, ministered to their wants during their time of sore distress. In the hospitals at Zautari, too, many wounded and sick blessed the kind English ladies who nursed them. And nothing can be finer than the thought of the poor sufferers unable to rest through pain, blessing the shadow of Florence Nightingale as it fell upon their pillow in the night watches. The wreck of the Birkenhead off the coast of Africa on the 27th of February, 1852, affords another memorable illustration of the chivalrous spirit of common men acting in this 19th century, of which any age might be proud. The vessel was steaming along the African coast with 472 men and 166 women and children on board. The men belonged to several regiments then serving at the Cape, and consisted principally of recruits who had been only a short time in the service. At 2 o'clock in the morning, while all were asleep below, the ship struck with violence upon a hidden rock which penetrated her bottom, and it was at once felt she must go down. The rolls of the drums called the soldiers to arms on the upper deck, and the men mustered as if on parade. The word was passed to save the women and children, and the helpless creatures were brought from below, mostly undressed, and handed silently into the boats. When they had all left the ship's side, the commander of the vessel thoughtlessly called out, "All those who can swim, jump overboard and make for the boats." But Captain Wright, of the 91st Highlanders, said, "No, if you do that, the boats with the women must be swamped." And the brave men stood motionless. There was no boat remaining, no hope of safety, but not a heart quailed. No one flinched from his duty in that trying moment. "There was not a murmur nor a cry amongst them," said Captain Wright, a survivor, "until the vessel made her final plunge." Down went the ship, and down went the heroic band, firing a feu de joie as they sank beneath the waves. Glory and honor to the gentle and the brave. The examples of such men never die, but, like their memories, are immortal. There are many tests by which a gentleman may be known, but there is one that never fails. How does he exercise power over those subordinate to him? How does he conduct himself towards women and children? How does the officer treat his men, the employer his servants, the master his pupils, and man in every station those who are weaker than himself? The discretion, forbearance, and kindliness with which power in such cases is used may indeed be regarded as the crucial test of gentlemanly character. When Lamont was one day passing through a crowd, he accidentally trod upon the foot of a young fellow, who forthwith struck him on the face. "Ah, sire," said Lamont, "you will surely be sorry for what you have done, when you know that I am blind. He who bullies those who are not in position to resist may be a snob, but cannot be a gentleman. He who tyrannizes over the weak and helpless may be a coward, but no true man. The tyrant, it has been said, is but a slave turned inside out. Strength, and the consciousness of strength, in a right-hearted man, imparts a nobleness to his character, but he will be most careful how he uses it, for, "It is excellent to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant." Gentleness is indeed the best test of gentlemanliness, a consideration for the feelings of others, for his inferiors and dependents as well as his equals, and respect for their self-respect, will pervade the true gentleman's whole conduct. He will rather himself suffer a small injury than by an uncharitable construction of another's behavior incur the risk of committing a great wrong. He will be forbearant of the weaknesses, the failings, and the errors of those whose advantages in life have not been equal to his own. He will be merciful even to his beast. He will not boast of his wealth, or his strength, or his gifts. He will not be puffed up by success, or unduly depressed by failure. He will not obtrude his views on others, but speak his mind freely when occasion calls for it. He will not confer favors with a patronizing air. Sir Walter Scott once said of Lord Lothian, "He is a man from whom one may receive a favor," and that's saying a great deal in these days. Lord Chatham has said that the gentleman is characterized by his sacrifice of self and preference of others to himself in the little daily occurrences of life. In illustration of this ruling spirit of considerateness in a noble character, we may cite the anecdote of the gallant Sir Ralph Abercrombie, of whom it is related that when mortally wounded in the battle of Albuquerque, he was carried in a litter on board the Fondurant, and to ease his pain a soldier's blanket was placed under his head, from which he experienced considerable relief. He asked what it was. "It's only a soldier's blanket," was the reply. "Whose blanket is it?" he said, half lifting himself up. "Only one of the men's." "I wish to know the name of the man whose blanket this is." "It is Duncan Roy's of the 42nd, Sir Ralph." "Then see that Duncan Roy gets his blanket this very night." Even to ease his dying agony, the general would not deprive the private soldier of his blanket for one night. The incident is as good in its way as that of the dying Signy handing his cup of water to the private soldier on the field of Zutphen. The quaint old Fuller sums up in a few words the character of the true gentleman and man of action in describing that of the great admiral Sir Francis Drake. Quote, "Chaste in his life, just in his dealings, true of his word, merciful to those who are under him, and hating nothing so much as idleness. In matters especially of moment, he was never wont to rely on other men's care, how trusty or skilful soever they may seem to be, but always contemning danger, and refusing no toil. He was wont himself to be one, whoever was a second, at every turn, wherever courage, skill, or industry was to be employed." End of section 35. End of Self-Help, with illustrations of conduct and perseverance, by Samuel Smiles.